Welcome, weary traveler, to a tale that winds through shadows and moonlight, through the labyrinth of a soul torn between darkness and dawn. Tonight, we follow the journey of one who bore many names: Genevieve, Shadowheart, daughter, stranger, faithful servant, and finally, her own person. This is a story of memories stolen and reclaimed, of faith corrupted and redeemed, of a heart that learned to beat for itself rather than the gods who would claim it. So settle beneath the gentle watch of distant stars. Let your breathing slow to match the rhythm of this ancient tale, and allow yourself to drift as we explore the complete story of one who walked through the deepest night to find her way home to the light. The story of the woman who would come to be known as Shadowheart begins not in the shadowed halls of Shah's temple, nor in the mind-bending terror of a nautiloid ship, but in a small village where moonlight danced through silver birch trees and the night air carried the gentle songs of crickets and nightingales. Here, in this peaceful hamlet nestled between rolling hills and whispering forests, a child was born who would know both the depths of manufactured darkness and the heights of chosen light. Genevieve came into the world on a night when Saloon's face shone full and bright, her silver radiance blessing the modest cottage where her parents waited with hearts full of hope and love. Her mother, whose hands were gentle as morning dew and whose voice carried the warmth of summer evenings, cradled her newborn daughter, while tears of joy traced paths down her cheeks. Her father, strong and kind, with eyes that held depths of wisdom earned through years of quiet service to the Moon Maiden, stood vigil by the window, watching the play of light and shadow across the forest that would become so significant to their daughter's fate. The village where Genevieve spent her earliest years was the kind of place that existed in harmony with the natural rhythms of the world. Here, the followers of Saloon tended their gardens by moonlight, sang their prayers to the night sky, and found in darkness not something to be feared, but something to be embraced as the necessary partner of light. Children played games of hide and seek among the silver shadows, learning early that darkness could be friend as well as mystery, sanctuary as well as unknown. Genevieve's childhood unfolded like a flower opening to receive both sun and moon. She learned to read by candlelight, her small fingers tracing the shapes of letters that told stories of heroes and healers, of journeys through starlit nights and the guidance that could be found in Saloon's ever-changing face. Her mother taught her to identify the healing herbs that grew in their garden, moonwort that glowed with pale luminescence, nightshade that required careful handling, silverleaf that could ease pain and promote restful sleep. From her father came different lessons, though no less important. He taught her to move quietly through the forest, to read the signs that animals left in soft earth and broken twigs, to understand the language that wind spoke through different types of leaves. There was something about the way he moved in the wilderness that spoke of deep familiarity, an almost supernatural connection to the wild places that Genevieve admired but did not yet understand. The other children of the village accepted her easily, as children do when they have not yet learned the arbitrary divisions that adults create. They played together in the twilight hours, chasing fireflies and telling stories about what lay beyond the forest's edge. Genevieve was known for her quick wit and ready laughter, for the way she could find four-leaf clovers with uncanny accuracy, and for her tendency to comfort other children when they scraped their knees or suffered the small heartbreaks that mark childhood's landscape. As she grew older, approaching the age when Selionite children traditionally underwent their coming-of-age ritual, Genevieve began to show signs of the gifts that often manifested in those blessed by the Moon Maiden. Small wounds would heal more quickly in her presence, nightmares would flee from those she comforted, and sometimes, in the deepest part of the night, she would wake with knowledge of things happening in distant places, a neighbor's cow about to give birth, a storm approaching from the west, a lost traveler who needed guidance. These manifestations of divine favor filled her parents with pride and hope. They spoke quietly between themselves about the possibility that their daughter might be called to serve as a cleric, perhaps even to travel beyond their small village to bring Selune's healing light to places where it was desperately needed. The thought of their daughter leaving was painful, but they understood that gifts such as hers came with responsibilities that extended beyond the boundaries of any single community. The ritual that would mark Genevelle's passage into adulthood was both ancient and deeply personal. Each child of the village underwent it differently, for Selune's guidance manifested uniquely for every individual. Some found their path by climbing to high places and meditation under the open sky. Others discovered their calling through service to those in need. Still, others underwent trials of courage or wisdom that tested their readiness to embrace the full weight of adult responsibility. For Genevelle, the elders decided that her trial would take place in the heart of the forest that had been such a constant presence throughout her childhood. She would be taken deep into the woods on a moonless night and left alone with nothing but the clothes on her back and her faith in Selune's guidance. Her task was to find her way home before dawn, navigating not just the physical challenges of the dark forest, but the emotional and spiritual challenges of facing her fears and discovering the strength that lay within her own heart. The night chosen for this ritual was one when the moon had waned to nothing, leaving the world draped in the kind of profound darkness that makes familiar places seem alien and threatening. Genevelle's parents accompanied her to the edge of the deep forest, their faces masks of carefully controlled concern. They had undergone similar trials in their own youth, but watching one's own child face such challenges required a different kind of courage than facing them oneself. Her mother embraced her one final time, whispering prayers for protection and guidance. Her father's hug was fierce and brief, his eyes reflecting an anxiety that he tried to hide but could not entirely suppress. There was something else in his expression as well, a knowledge of the forest's deeper secrets that he had never shared with his daughter, shadows within shadows that she would need to navigate without his guidance or protection. As her parents melted back into the darkness from which they had come, Genevelle stood alone at the forest's edge. The trees that had been her playground and classroom throughout childhood now loomed before her like massive sentinels, their branches creating patterns of absolute black against the star-scattered sky. The sounds of the night forest were different here, deeper in the wilderness, the calls of nocturnal birds she could not identify, the rustle of unseen creatures moving through the underbrush, the creaking of ancient wood that spoke of winds she could not feel. Taking a deep breath to steady her nerves, Genevelle stepped forward into the embrace of the waiting darkness. The forest floor beneath her feet was soft with decades of fallen leaves, creating a carpet that muffled her footsteps but also concealed roots and stones that threatened to trip the unwary. The air was thick with the scents of growing things, rich earth, decaying vegetation, the green smell of life persisting even in the darkest places. As she moved deeper into the forest, following paths that were more memory than visible reality, Genevelle found herself entering a state of heightened awareness that she had never experienced before. Every sound seemed amplified, every scent carried layers of information, every shift in the air against her skin told her something about the world around her. This was what her parents had tried to teach her about trust, not just trust in Selune's guidance, but trust in her own senses, her own instincts, her own ability to navigate challenges that seemed impossible. The hours passed with dreamlike slowness. Sometimes she found herself on paths that seemed familiar, that filled her with hope that she was moving in the right direction. Other times she found herself in clearings that felt completely alien, places where the very air seemed to vibrate with ancient presences that watched her passage with neither hostility nor welcome, but with the detached interest of forces far older and stranger than human concerns. It was in one such clearing, perhaps 3 hours after she had begun her journey, that Genevelle encountered something that would change the entire trajectory of her life. She had paused to rest beside a fallen log, using the quiet moment to listen for any sounds that might guide her toward home when she became aware of movement in the shadows at the clearing's edge. At first, she thought it might be a deer or some other forest creature going about its nocturnal business. The movement was too fluid, too purposeful to be mere swaying of branches in the wind. But as her eyes adjusted to the particular quality of darkness in that place, she began to make out a shape that sent ice through her veins despite all her childhood familiarity with the forest and its inhabitants. A wolf emerged from the tree line, its form somehow both utterly natural and completely wrong. It was larger than any wolf should be, its eyes reflecting starlight with an intelligence that seemed almost human. Its movements were too controlled, too deliberate, speaking of purpose rather than the simple hunting instincts of a wild animal. As it approached her resting place, she could see that its fur was dark as midnight, that its breath came in visible puffs despite the warmth of the evening, and that something in its bearing spoke of recognition, as though it knew exactly who she was and had been searching for her specifically. Terror filled Geneviève's chest, the kind of primal fear that bypasses rational thought and strikes directly at the most ancient parts of the human mind. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to flee deeper into the forest where the undergrowth might slow the creature's pursuit, to climb trees whose branches might provide sanctuary from those gleaming fangs. But something else held her frozen in place, not just fear, but a strange sense of familiarity, as though somewhere in the deepest recesses of her memory she had encountered this creature before. The wolf continued its approach, moving with the patient confidence of a predator that knows its prey has nowhere to go. Each step brought it closer to the fallen log where she sat. Each moment stretched her terror tighter until she felt as though her heart might burst from the strain. The creature's eyes never left hers, and in their depths she thought she glimpsed something that was not entirely animal, a sadness, perhaps, or an urgency that had nothing to do with hunger. It was then, in that moment of perfect terror and perfect stillness, that the night erupted into chaos. Dark figures burst from the forest around the clearing, moving with coordinated precision that spoke of careful planning and patient observation. These were not forest dwellers or chance travelers, but people who had come to this place with specific purpose and had waited for exactly this moment to act. The newcomers wore robes of deep purple and black, their faces hidden beneath hoods that seemed to drink in what little starlight reached the forest floor. They moved with practiced silence, forming a circle around both Geneviève and the mysterious wolf, cutting off all avenues of escape. In their hands they carried weapons that gleamed with more than mere reflected light, curved daggers and twisted staves that pulsed with energies that made the air itself seem to recoil. The wolf spun to face these new arrivals, its posture shifting from predatory stalking to protective defense. A growl rumbled from its throat, deep and menacing, carrying warning and challenge in equal measure, but the newcomers showed no fear of the creature's threat. Instead, they began to chant in voices that seemed to steal warmth from the air, words in a language that Geneviève did not recognize, but that made her skin crawl with their implications. What followed was a battle that seared itself into Genevieve's memory with traumatic clarity. The wolf fought with desperate fury, its movements combining animal ferocity with an almost human intelligence in its tactical choices. It struck at the cultists with claws and fangs, seeking to break their circle and create an opening for escape. But the dark figures were prepared for such resistance, and their weapons carried enchantments that turned what should have been mortal wounds into mere inconveniences. Geneviève found herself caught in the center of this supernatural conflict, too terrified to move but too shocked to look away. The sounds of combat filled the clearing, snarls and battle cries, the clash of claw against enchanted metal, the thud of bodies striking the earth. The air itself seemed to thicken with the energies being unleashed, making each breath an effort and filling her lungs with the taste of something ancient and malevolent. The battle's outcome was inevitable from the moment it began. The wolf, for all its fierce resistance, was outnumbered and outmatched by opponents who had come prepared for exactly this confrontation. Gradually, its attacks grew weaker, its movements slower, until finally it collapsed beside the fallen log where Genevieve still sat frozen. Even unconscious, the creature's form seemed to shimmer and shift, as though its very nature was somehow unstable. As the echoes of combat faded from the clearing, one of the robed figures approached Genevieve with movements that managed to be both gentle and utterly terrifying. The hood fell back to reveal the face of a woman whose beauty was marred by eyes that held depths of cruelty that no human expression should contain. Her voice, when she spoke, carried the kind of authority that comes from absolute certainty in one's own power and righteousness. The woman introduced herself as a servant of Shah, the mistress of night, though these names meant nothing to Genevieve at the time. She spoke of rescue, of salvation from the terrible fate that the wolf had intended for her, of the protection that only Shah's embrace could provide. Her words were honey over poison, designed to sound like comfort while beginning the subtle process of psychological manipulation that would define the next decades of Genevieve's existence. The other cultists moved with practiced efficiency, binding both the unconscious wolf and the paralyzed girl with ropes that seemed to absorb light rather than merely blocking it. As they prepared to leave the clearing, Genevieve caught glimpses of the wolf's true nature as its form shifted and wavered in unconsciousness. For brief moments, she thought she saw not an animal at all, but a man's face twisted with pain and desperate concern, features that struck her as familiar, though she could not place where she might have seen them before. The journey from that clearing to whatever destination awaited them passed in a haze of shock and confusion. Genevieve found herself carried through parts of the forest she had never seen, along paths that seemed to exist solely for the use of these dark figures. The cultists moved with the confidence of people who knew exactly where they were going and had traveled these routes many times before. Their destination was not some distant stronghold, but a hidden camp that had been established within the very forest where she had played throughout her childhood. As dawn approached, painting the eastern sky with pale fingers of light, Genevieve was brought to understand the true scope of what had been done to her and her family. The wolf, she learned, had not been hunting her at all, but trying to protect her. The familiar features she had glimpsed in its shifting form belonged to her own father, cursed with lycanthropy but driven by parental love to find his daughter before the cultists could claim her. Her parents, she discovered, had been captured as well. They had been bound and gagged, their eyes wide with horror and desperate love as they watched their daughter being inducted into mysteries that would steal her very identity. The cultists had planned this night with meticulous care, using their knowledge of the coming-of-age ritual to ensure that Genevieve would be isolated and vulnerable at exactly the moment they chose to strike. The woman who had spoken to her in the clearing, who would later reveal herself as Viconia de Vere, one of Shah's most devoted servants, explained with clinical precision how the night's events fit into a larger design. Genevieve's capture was not random, but the culmination of months of observation and planning. She had been chosen specifically because of her connection to Saloon, because of the gifts that marked her as significant to the moon goddess's plans. But more than that, she had been chosen to serve as proof of Shah's ultimate victory over her twin sister. The plan was elegant in its cruelty: to take a child blessed by Saloon and transform her into Shah's most devoted servant, to corrupt everything she had been taught about light and hope, and turn those very teachings into weapons against everything she had once held sacred. As the sun rose over the forest clearing that had been the site of so much violence and betrayal, Genevieve looked into her parents' eyes and saw there a grief that went beyond mere physical captivity. They understood, perhaps better than she did in that moment, exactly what was being taken from them. Not just their daughter's freedom, but her very self, her memories, her beliefs, her connection to everything that had given her life meaning and joy. The last thing she remembered clearly from that morning was the sound of her mother weeping muffled by the gag that prevented her from speaking words of comfort or farewell. It was a sound that would haunt the deepest recesses of her mind for decades to come, buried beneath layers of manufactured memories and indoctrinated beliefs, but never entirely erased. Even when she could no longer consciously recall her mother's face, some part of her would always remember the sound of that grief, the knowledge that somewhere in the world, people who loved her were suffering because of what she had become. The transformation that began that morning would take years to complete, but its foundations were laid in those first hours of captivity. The cultists began immediately to work their subtle magics, spells designed not to break their captive's mind but to reshape it, to plant new memories and associations that would gradually overwrite the authentic experiences of her first 13 years of life. They spoke to her constantly of Shah's love, of the freedom that came from embracing loss, of the lies that beings like Saloon used to keep people trapped in cycles of false hope. But even as they began their psychological assault, even as they started the long process of turning Genevieve into Shadowheart, some essential part of her remained untouched by their manipulations. Deep in the core of her being, protected by bonds of love that no amount of magic could entirely sever, the memory of moonlight and laughter and parents who would sacrifice everything for her safety remained intact, waiting for the day when she would be strong enough to reclaim what had been stolen from her. The forest clearing where her childhood had ended grew quiet as the cult Baldur's Gate Shadowheart. Welcome, weary traveler, to a tale that winds through shadows and moonlight, through the labyrinth of a soul torn between darkness and dawn. Tonight, we follow the journey of one who bore many names: Genevieve, Shadowheart, daughter, stranger, faithful servant, and finally, her own person. This is a story of memories stolen and reclaimed, of faith corrupted and redeemed, of a heart that learned to beat for itself rather than the gods who would claim it. So settle beneath the gentle watch of distant stars. Let your breathing slow to match the rhythm of this ancient tale, and allow yourself to drift as we explore the complete story of one who walked through the deepest night to find her way home to the light. The story of the woman who would come to be known as Shadowheart begins not in the shadowed halls of Shah's temple, nor in the mind-bending terror of a nautiloid ship, but in a small village where moonlight danced through silver birch trees and the night air carried the gentle songs of crickets and nightingales. Here, in this peaceful hamlet nestled between rolling hills and whispering forests, a child was born who would know both the depths of manufactured darkness and the heights of chosen light. Genevieve came into the world on a night when Saloon's face shone full and bright, her silver radiance blessing the modest cottage where her parents waited with hearts full of hope and love. Her mother, whose hands were gentle as morning dew and whose voice carried the warmth of summer evenings, cradled her newborn daughter, while tears of joy traced paths down her cheeks. Her father, strong and kind, with eyes that held depths of wisdom earned through years of quiet service to the Moon Maiden, stood vigil by the window, watching the play of light and shadow across the forest that would become so significant to their daughter's fate. The village where Genevieve spent her earliest years was the kind of place that existed in harmony with the natural rhythms of the world. Here, the followers of Saloon tended their gardens by moonlight, sang their prayers to the night sky, and found in darkness not something to be feared, but something to be embraced as the necessary partner of light. Children played games of hide and seek among the silver shadows, learning early that darkness could be friend as well as mystery, sanctuary as well as unknown. Genevieve's childhood unfolded like a flower opening to receive both sun and moon. She learned to read by candlelight, her small fingers tracing the shapes of letters that told stories of heroes and healers, of journeys through starlit nights and the guidance that could be found in Saloon's ever-changing face. Her mother taught her to identify the healing herbs that grew in their garden, moonwort that glowed with pale luminescence, nightshade that required careful handling, silverleaf that could Baldur's Gate Shadowheart. Welcome, weary traveler, to a tale that winds through shadows and moonlight, through the labyrinth of a soul torn between darkness and dawn. Tonight, we follow the journey of one who bore many names: Genevieve, Shadowheart, daughter, stranger, faithful servant, and finally, her own person. This is a story of memories stolen and reclaimed, of faith corrupted and redeemed, of a heart that learned to beat for itself rather than the gods who would claim it. So settle beneath the gentle watch of distant stars. Let your breathing slow to match the rhythm of this ancient tale, and allow yourself to drift as we explore the complete story of one who walked through the deepest night to find her way home to the light. The story of the woman who would come to be known as Shadowheart begins not in the shadowed halls of Shah's temple, nor in the mind-bending terror of a nautiloid ship, but in a small village where moonlight danced through silver birch trees and the night air carried the gentle songs of crickets and nightingales. Here, in this peaceful hamlet nestled between rolling hills and whispering forests, a child was born who would know both the depths of manufactured darkness and the heights of chosen light. Genevieve came into the world on a night when Saloon's face shone full and bright, her silver radiance blessing the modest cottage where her parents waited with hearts full of hope and love. Her mother, whose hands were gentle as morning dew and whose voice carried the warmth of summer evenings, cradled her newborn daughter, while tears of joy traced paths down her cheeks. Her father, strong and kind, with eyes that held depths of wisdom earned through years of quiet service to the Moon Maiden, stood vigil by the window, watching the play of light and shadow across the forest that would become so significant to their daughter's fate. The village where Genevieve spent her earliest years was the kind of place that existed in harmony with the natural rhythms of the world. Here, the followers of Saloon tended their gardens by moonlight, sang their prayers to the night sky, and found in darkness not something to be feared, but something to be embraced as the necessary partner of light. Children played games of hide and seek among the silver shadows, learning early that darkness could be friend as well as mystery, sanctuary as well as unknown. Genevieve's childhood unfolded like a flower opening to receive both sun and moon. She learned to read by candlelight, her small fingers tracing the shapes of letters that told stories of heroes and healers, of journeys through starlit nights and the guidance that could be found in Saloon's ever-changing face. Her mother taught her to identify the healing herbs that grew in their garden, moonwort that glowed with pale luminescence, nightshade that required careful handling, silverleaf that could ease pain and promote restful sleep. From her father came different lessons, though no less important. He taught her to move quietly through the forest, to read the signs that animals left in soft earth and broken twigs, to understand the language that wind spoke through different types of leaves. There was something about the way he moved in the wilderness that spoke of deep familiarity, an almost supernatural connection to the wild places that Genevieve admired but did not yet understand. The other children of the village accepted her easily, as children do when they have not yet learned the arbitrary divisions that adults create. They played together in the twilight hours, chasing fireflies and telling stories about what lay beyond the forest's edge. Genevieve was known for her quick wit and ready laughter, for the way she could find four-leaf clovers with uncanny accuracy, and for her tendency to comfort other children when they scraped their knees or suffered the small heartbreaks that mark childhood's landscape. As she grew older, approaching the age when Selunite children traditionally underwent their coming-of-age ritual, Genevieve began to show signs of the gifts that often manifested in those blessed by the Moon Maiden. Small wounds would heal more quickly in her presence, nightmares would flee from those she comforted, and sometimes, in the deepest part of the night, she would wake with knowledge of things happening in distant places, a neighbor's cow about to give birth, a storm approaching from the west, a lost traveler who needed guidance. These manifestations of divine favor filled her parents with pride and hope. They spoke quietly between themselves about the possibility that their daughter might be called to serve as a cleric, perhaps even to travel beyond their small village to bring Selune's healing light to places where it was desperately needed. The thought of their daughter leaving was painful, but they understood that gifts such as hers came with responsibilities that extended beyond the boundaries of any single community. The ritual that would mark Genevelle's passage into adulthood was both ancient and deeply personal. Each child of the village underwent it differently, for Selune's guidance manifested uniquely for every individual. Some found their path by climbing to high places and meditation under the open sky. Others discovered their calling through service to those in need. Still, others underwent trials of courage or wisdom that tested their readiness to embrace the full weight of adult responsibility. For Genevelle, the elders decided that her trial would take place in the heart of the forest that had been such a constant presence throughout her childhood. She would be taken deep into the woods on a moonless night and left alone with nothing but the clothes on her back and her faith in Selune's guidance. Her task was to find her way home before dawn, navigating not just the physical challenges of the dark forest, but the emotional and spiritual challenges of facing her fears and discovering the strength that lay within her own heart. The night chosen for this ritual was one when the moon had waned to nothing, leaving the world draped in the kind of profound darkness that makes familiar places seem alien and threatening. Genevelle's parents accompanied her to the edge of the deep forest, their faces masks of carefully controlled concern. They had undergone similar trials in their own youth, but watching one's own child face such challenges required a different kind of courage than facing them oneself. Her mother embraced her one final time, whispering prayers for protection and guidance. Her father's hug was fierce and brief, his eyes reflecting an anxiety that he tried to hide but could not entirely suppress. There was something else in his expression as well, a knowledge of the forest's deeper secrets that he had never shared with his daughter, shadows within shadows that she would need to navigate without his guidance or protection. As her parents melted back into the darkness from which they had come, Genevelle stood alone at the forest's edge. The trees that had been her playground and classroom throughout childhood now loomed before her like massive sentinels, their branches creating patterns of absolute black against the star-scattered sky. The sounds of the night forest were different here, deeper in the wilderness, the calls of nocturnal birds she could not identify, the rustle of unseen creatures moving through the underbrush, the creaking of ancient wood that spoke of winds she could not feel. Taking a deep breath to steady her nerves, Genevelle stepped forward into the embrace of the waiting darkness. The forest floor beneath her feet was soft with decades of fallen leaves, creating a carpet that muffled her footsteps but also concealed roots and stones that threatened to trip the unwary. The air was thick with the scents of growing things, rich earth, decaying vegetation, the green smell of life persisting even in the darkest places. As she moved deeper into the forest, following paths that were more memory than visible reality, Genevelle found herself entering a state of heightened awareness that she had never experienced before. Every sound seemed amplified, every scent carried layers of information, every shift in the air against her skin told her something about the world around her. This was what her parents had tried to teach her about trust, not just trust in Selune's guidance, but trust in her own senses, her own instincts, her own ability to navigate challenges that seemed impossible. The hours passed with dreamlike slowness. Sometimes she found herself on paths that seemed familiar, that filled her with hope that she was moving in the right direction. Other times she found herself in clearings that felt completely alien, places where the very air seemed to vibrate with ancient presences that watched her passage with neither hostility nor welcome, but with the detached interest of forces far older and stranger than human concerns. It was in one such clearing, perhaps 3 hours after she had begun her journey, that Genevelle encountered something that would change the entire trajectory of her life. She had paused to rest beside a fallen log, using the quiet moment to listen for any sounds that might guide her toward home, when she became aware of movement in the shadows at the clearing's edge. At first, she thought it might be a deer or some other forest creature going about its nocturnal business. The movement was too fluid, too purposeful to be mere swaying of branches in the wind. But as her eyes adjusted to the particular quality of darkness in that place, she began to make out a shape that sent ice through her veins despite all her childhood familiarity with the forest and its inhabitants. A wolf emerged from the tree line, its form somehow both utterly natural and completely wrong. It was larger than any wolf should be, its eyes reflecting starlight with an intelligence that seemed almost human. Its movements were too controlled, too deliberate, speaking of purpose rather than the simple hunting instincts of a wild animal. As it approached her resting place, she could see that its fur was dark as midnight, that its breath came in visible puffs, despite the warmth of the evening, and that something in its bearing spoke of recognition, as though it knew exactly who she was and had been searching for her specifically. Terror filled Geneviève's chest, the kind of primal fear that bypasses rational thought and strikes directly at the most ancient parts of the human mind. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to flee deeper into the forest where the undergrowth might slow the creature's pursuit, to climb trees whose branches might provide sanctuary from those gleaming fangs. But something else held her frozen in place, not just fear, but a strange sense of familiarity, as though somewhere in the deepest recesses of her memory she had encountered this creature before. The wolf continued its approach, moving with the patient confidence of a predator that knows its prey has nowhere to go. Each step brought it closer to the fallen log where she sat. Each moment stretched her terror tighter until she felt as though her heart might burst from the strain. The creature's eyes never left hers, and in their depths she thought she glimpsed something that was not entirely animal, a sadness, perhaps, or an urgency that had nothing to do with hunger. It was then, in that moment of perfect terror and perfect stillness, that the night erupted into chaos. Dark figures burst from the forest around the clearing, moving with coordinated precision that spoke of careful planning and patient observation. These were not forest dwellers or chance travelers, but people who had come to this place with specific purpose and had waited for exactly this moment to act. The newcomers wore robes of deep purple and black, their faces hidden beneath hoods that seemed to drink in what little starlight reached the forest floor. They moved with practiced silence, forming a circle around both Geneviève and the mysterious wolf, cutting off all avenues of escape. In their hands they carried weapons that gleamed with more than mere reflected light, curved daggers and twisted staves that pulsed with energies that made the air itself seem to recoil. The wolf spun to face these new arrivals, its posture shifting from predatory stalking to protective defense. A growl rumbled from its throat, deep and menacing, carrying warning and challenge in equal measure. But the newcomers showed no fear of the creature's threat. Instead, they began to chant in voices that seemed to steal warmth from the air, words in a language that Geneviève did not recognize, but that made her skin crawl with their implications. What followed was a battle that seared itself into Genevieve's memory with traumatic clarity. The wolf fought with desperate fury, its movements combining animal ferocity with an almost human intelligence in its tactical choices. It struck at the cultists with claws and fangs, seeking to break their circle and create an opening for escape. But the dark figures were prepared for such resistance, and their weapons carried enchantments that turned what should have been mortal wounds into mere inconveniences. Geneviève found herself caught in the center of this supernatural conflict, too terrified to move but too shocked to look away. The sounds of combat filled the clearing, snarls and battle cries, the clash of claw against enchanted metal, the thud of bodies striking the earth. The air itself seemed to thicken with the energies being unleashed, making each breath an effort and filling her lungs with the taste of something ancient and malevolent. The battle's outcome was inevitable from the moment it began. The wolf, for all its fierce resistance, was outnumbered and outmatched by opponents who had come prepared for exactly this confrontation. Gradually, its attacks grew weaker, its movements slower, until finally it collapsed beside the fallen log where Genevieve still sat frozen. Even unconscious, the creature's form seemed to shimmer and shift, as though its very nature was somehow unstable. As the echoes of combat faded from the clearing, one of the robed figures approached Genevieve with movements that managed to be both gentle and utterly terrifying. The hood fell back to reveal the face of a woman whose beauty was marred by eyes that held depths of cruelty that no human expression should contain. Her voice, when she spoke, carried the kind of authority that comes from absolute certainty in one's own power and righteousness. The woman introduced herself as a servant of Shah, the mistress of night, though these names meant nothing to Genevieve at the time. She spoke of rescue, of salvation from the terrible fate that the wolf had intended for her, of the protection that only Shah's embrace could provide. Her words were honey over poison, designed to sound like comfort while beginning the subtle process of psychological manipulation that would define the next decades of Genevieve's existence. The other cultists moved with practiced efficiency, binding both the unconscious wolf and the paralyzed girl with ropes that seemed to absorb light rather than merely blocking it. As they prepared to leave the clearing, Genevieve caught glimpses of the wolf's true nature as its form shifted and wavered in unconsciousness. For brief moments, she thought she saw not an animal at all, but a man's face twisted with pain and desperate concern, features that struck her as familiar, though she could not place where she might have seen them before. The journey from that clearing to whatever destination awaited them passed in a haze of shock and confusion. Genevieve found herself carried through parts of the forest she had never seen, along paths that seemed to exist solely for the use of these dark figures. The cultists moved with the confidence of people who knew exactly where they were going and had traveled these routes many times before. Their destination was not some distant stronghold, but a hidden camp that had been established within the very forest where she had played throughout her childhood. As dawn approached, painting the eastern sky with pale fingers of light, Genevieve was brought to understand the true scope of what had been done to her and her family. The wolf, she learned, had not been hunting her at all, but trying to protect her. The familiar features she had glimpsed in its shifting form belonged to her own father, cursed with lycanthropy but driven by parental love to find his daughter before the cultists could claim her. Her parents, she discovered, had been captured as well. They had been bound and gagged, their eyes wide with horror and desperate love as they watched their daughter being inducted into mysteries that would steal her very identity. The cultists had planned this night with meticulous care, using their knowledge of the coming-of-age ritual to ensure that Genevieve would be isolated and vulnerable at exactly the moment they chose to strike. The woman who had spoken to her in the clearing, who would later reveal herself as Viconia de Vere, one of Shah's most devoted servants, explained with clinical precision how the night's events fit into a larger design. Genevieve's capture was not random, but the culmination of months of observation and planning. She had been chosen specifically because of her connection to Saloon, because of the gifts that marked her as significant to the moon goddess's plans. But more than that, she had been chosen to serve as proof of Shah's ultimate victory over her twin sister. The plan was elegant in its cruelty: to take a child blessed by Saloon and transform her into Shah's most devoted servant, to corrupt everything she had been taught about light and hope, and turn those very teachings into weapons against everything she had once held sacred. As the sun rose over the forest clearing that had been the site of so much violence and betrayal, Genevieve looked into her parents' eyes and saw there a grief that went beyond mere physical captivity. They understood, perhaps better than she did in that moment, exactly what was being taken from them. Not just their daughter's freedom, but her very self, her memories, her beliefs, her connection to everything that had given her life meaning and joy. The last thing she remembered clearly from that morning was the sound of her mother weeping, muffled by the gag that prevented her from speaking words of comfort or farewell. It was a sound that would haunt the deepest recesses of her mind for decades to come, buried beneath layers of manufactured memories and indoctrinated beliefs, but never entirely erased. Even when she could no longer consciously recall her mother's face, some part of her would always remember the sound of that grief, the knowledge that somewhere in the world, people who loved her were suffering because of what she had become. The transformation that began that morning would take years to complete, but its foundations were laid in those first hours of captivity. The cultists began immediately to work their subtle magics, spells designed not to break their captive's mind but to reshape it, to plant new memories and associations that would gradually overwrite the authentic experiences of her first 13 years of life. They spoke to her constantly of Shah's love, of the freedom that came from embracing loss, of the lies that beings like Saloon used to keep people trapped in cycles of false hope. But even as they began their psychological assault, even as they started the long process of turning Genevieve into Shadowheart, some essential part of her remained untouched by their manipulations. Deep in the core of her being, protected by bonds of love that no amount of magic could entirely sever, the memory of moonlight and laughter and parents who would sacrifice everything for her safety remained intact, waiting for the day when she would be strong enough to reclaim what had been stolen from her. The forest clearing where her childhood had ended grew quiet as the cultists departed with their captives, leaving behind only trampled earth and the lingering echo of violence. But the trees themselves remembered what had transpired there, and sometimes, in the years that followed, travelers passing through that place would report strange sensations, the sound of weeping carried on the wind, the glimpse of silver light where no moon shone, the feeling of being watched by presences that grieved for innocence lost and family destroyed. The transformation of Genevieve into Shadowheart did not happen overnight, though in her later memories it would seem as sudden as the snuffing of a candle. The process was as methodical as it was cruel, designed by minds that had perfected the art of breaking and remaking human souls across centuries of devoted practice. Viconia de Vere, the drow cleric who had orchestrated her capture, understood that true conversion could not be achieved through mere torture or intimidation. The mind, when pressed too hard, had ways of fracturing that made it useless for the delicate work that lay ahead. The hidden compound where Genevieve was brought existed in a pocket of reality that seemed somehow disconnected from the natural world around it. Ancient magic had been worked into its very foundations, spells that bent light and sound, and even the passage of time itself to serve the purposes of those who dwelt within its boundaries. From the outside, travelers passing through the forest might glimpse nothing more than a particularly dense thicket or an unremarkable grove of trees. But within, chambers and corridors stretched deep into the earth, carved from living rock and adorned with symbols that hurt to look upon directly. The first weeks of her captivity were designed to establish new patterns of thought and behavior while her original identity remained relatively intact. Viconia understood that complete memory suppression would come later, after the groundwork had been properly laid. For now, it was enough to create confusion, to plant seeds of doubt about everything Genevieve thought she knew about herself and her place in the world. The child who had once laughed beneath moonlight found herself in chambers where no natural light could penetrate, where the only illumination came from torches that burned with flames of unnatural colors, purple and black and deep crimson that cast shadows which seemed to move independently of their sources. The air itself was different here, thick with incense that carried psychoactive properties designed to make thought sluggish and memory unreliable. She was not kept in a cell, which would have been too obviously a prison, and might have strengthened her resistance through the clarity of opposition. Instead, she was given quarters that were almost comfortable, a small room with a bed, a desk, even books to read. though all of them had been carefully selected to introduce concepts that would prepare her mind for what was to come. These volumes spoke of the illusory nature of hope, of the freedom that could be found in embracing darkness, of ancient wisdoms that challenged everything she had been taught about good and evil. The daily routine imposed upon her was structured to gradually erode her sense of individual agency while replacing it with dependence upon external authority. She woke each morning to the sound of bells that rang with notes too deep for human ears to hear comfortably, a sound that seemed to resonate in her bones and make clear thought difficult. Meals were provided at irregular intervals, never quite when hunger might have made her expect them, creating a constant state of low-level anxiety about when the next opportunity for sustenance might arrive. Between these carefully orchestrated disruptions to her natural rhythms, Genevieve was subjected to what Viconia termed educational sessions, lengthy discussions about theology and philosophy that were presented as opportunities for intellectual growth, but were actually sophisticated forms of psychological manipulation. These conversations began with concepts that seemed reasonable enough, questions about the nature of suffering and the apparent arbitrariness of divine favor. Why? Viconia would ask with apparent genuine curiosity, did good people suffer while the wicked prospered? What was the point of hope when it so often led to disappointment? Was it not more honest to acknowledge the fundamental darkness of existence rather than clinging to illusions that would inevitably be shattered? These questions were not presented as rhetorical challenges, but as sincere inquiries into the nature of reality, invitations for Genevieve to participate in scholarly discourse about the deepest mysteries of existence. The brilliance of this approach lay in how it recruited Genevieve's own intelligence against her. Rather than being told what to think, she was guided through seemingly logical progressions of reasoning that led inevitably toward conclusions that served Shah's purposes. Each step in the argument seemed reasonable on its own. Each conclusion appeared to follow naturally from premises she had already accepted. By the time she realized where the chain of reasoning was leading, she had already invested enough of herself in the process to feel committed to its outcome. The isolation was perhaps the most effective tool in Viconia's arsenal. Genevieve saw her parents occasionally, but always under circumstances that reinforced her captor's narrative about the situation. They appeared broken, defeated, their faces marked by suffering that seemed to grow worse each time she saw them. When she tried to offer them comfort or reassurance, the cultists would gently redirect her attention to how her presence seemed to increase rather than decrease their anguish. Was this not, they suggested, evidence of the fundamental cruelty of attachment? Did her love for her parents not become a weapon that could be used against all of them? Would it not be kinder, ultimately, to let go of such bonds rather than allowing them to become sources of mutual torment? These questions were never posed as demands but as observations, invitations for her to draw her own conclusions about the nature of love and loss. The memory suppression rituals began gradually, introduced as medical treatments for the trauma she had experienced during her capture. The magic involved was subtle and sophisticated, designed not to simply erase memories but to make them increasingly difficult to access while simultaneously providing alternative narratives to fill the gaps that remained. The process was uncomfortable rather than painful, leaving her feeling dizzy and disoriented but not in obvious distress. After each session, Genevieve would find that certain details of her past had become fuzzy or uncertain. Had her childhood really been as happy as she remembered? Or was she romanticizing experiences that had actually been more complicated? The loving parents, she recalled, were they real or idealized figures created by a mind struggling to make sense of abandonment and betrayal? The cultists never directly contradicted her memories, but they asked gentle questions that made her doubt the reliability of her own recollections. The false memories that replaced her authentic experiences were works of psychological artistry, crafted with the same care that a master painter might bring to a portrait. They felt real because they contained genuine emotional content, but that content had been carefully curated to serve specific purposes. The new narrative of her past portrayed her as an orphan who had been rescued by Shah's followers from abandonment and abuse, taken in by people who recognized her potential and loved her enough to help her discover her true calling. The memory of being found in the forest remained, but its context was gradually altered. The wolf became a genuine threat rather than her transformed father trying to protect her. The cultists became rescuers rather than kidnappers. The fear and trauma she had experienced became evidence of Shah's mercy in delivering her from danger rather than proof of violence done against her. Each altered memory was internally consistent and emotionally satisfying in ways that made questioning them seem not just unnecessary but actively harmful. As months passed, the original Genevieve began to feel more like a character from a story she had read than a person she had actually been. The memories remained accessible, technically, but they felt increasingly unreal, like dreams that become less vivid each time they are recalled. In their place, a new identity began to emerge, one that had always been destined for service to Shah, one that had found in the Mistress of Night the mother and mentor she had always unconsciously sought. The theological indoctrination that accompanied this psychological reconstruction was presented not as dogma to be accepted, but as revelation to be discovered. Genevieve was encouraged to study Shah's teachings with the same intellectual rigor she might have brought to any academic subject, to ask questions and raise objections that could then be addressed through careful reasoning and personal experience. This approach made her feel like an active participant in her own conversion rather than a passive victim of external manipulation. The central tenets of Shah's faith, as they were presented to her, seemed to offer solutions to the very philosophical problems that her captors had helped her identify. If existence was fundamentally characterized by suffering and loss, then wisdom lay in accepting this reality rather than fighting against it. If hope was ultimately an illusion that made disappointment more painful, then peace could be found in releasing such expectations. If attachment led inevitably to grief, then freedom could be achieved by learning to love without grasping. These concepts were not presented as pessimistic or nihilistic, but as forms of profound spiritual sophistication. To embrace loss was not to give up on life, but to engage with it more honestly. To accept darkness was not to reject light, but to understand the necessary balance between opposing forces. To serve Shah was not to worship evil, but to acknowledge the essential role that endings played in making beginnings possible. The physical mark that would become her most distinctive feature was introduced during a ceremony that she experienced as an honor rather than a violation. The wound on her hand was explained as a sacred stigmata, a sign of Shah's personal attention and favor. The pain it caused was reframed as a form of divine communication, a reminder of her special status and her goddess's continuing presence in her life. The ritual itself was conducted with impressive pageantry, designed to make her feel important and chosen rather than victimized. She was dressed in robes of deep purple and black, colors that seemed to absorb light and make her pale skin luminous by contrast. The chamber where the ceremony took place was filled with other devotees who watched with apparent envy as she received what they clearly regarded as a tremendous blessing. When Viconia pressed the sacred dagger into her palm, creating the wound that would never fully heal, Genevieve felt not agony, but a strange sense of completion, as though some essential part of herself had finally been awakened. The pain that followed was intense but manageable, and it carried with it a peculiar satisfaction, a sense that she was finally becoming who she had always been meant to be. The connection between her wound and her parents' suffering was never explicitly explained to her during these early years. She was told only that the mark was a sign of her bond with Shah, a physical manifestation of the spiritual relationship that made her special among the goddess's children. The fact that her parents experienced sympathetic pain whenever the wound flared was presented, when she noticed it at all, as evidence of how her growing spiritual power affected even those around her. Training in the practical aspects of Shah's service began as soon as her basic theological education was considered complete. She learned to move silently through darkness, to blend with shadows as though she had been born to them, to read the subtle signs that indicated the presence of enemies or opportunities. These skills were presented as arts rather than weapons, forms of spiritual discipline that would help her serve her goddess more effectively. The magic that came with her clerical training felt like coming home to abilities she had always possessed but never known how to access. When she called upon Shah's power to heal wounds or cure diseases, the energy that flowed through her felt perfectly natural, as though her body had always been designed to serve as a conduit for such forces. The spells of darkness and misdirection that formed the core of her goddess's arsenal seemed to respond to her will almost before she finished casting them. Combat training was integrated seamlessly with her spiritual education, presented as another form of prayer and devotion. The weapons she learned to wield, maces and shields blessed by Shah's touch, felt perfectly balanced in her hands, extensions of her own body rather than external tools. The techniques she mastered for defensive fighting emphasized protection of the innocent and preservation of life, values that seemed entirely consistent with her understanding of her goddess's true nature. As years passed, the question of what had happened to the original Genevieve became increasingly academic. The young woman who emerged from her training carried the name Shadowheart with pride, understanding it not as a replacement for her birth name but as a revelation of her true identity. The memories of her childhood in the Selunite village remained accessible, but they felt like stories about someone else, experiences that had shaped her but did not define her. The relationship she developed with her fellow initiates was carefully managed to prevent the formation of bonds that might compete with her devotion to Shah. Friendships were permitted, even encouraged, but they were always structured around shared service rather than personal affection. The other students were presented as siblings in faith rather than individuals with their own needs and desires, fellow travelers on a path that led ultimately to the same destination. Shadowheart excelled in her studies with the kind of focused intensity that impressed even Viconia. Her essays on Sharon theology demonstrated not just understanding but genuine insight, creative applications of doctrine that suggested she was developing her own relationship with the goddess rather than simply parroting what she had been taught. Her practical skills advanced with remarkable speed, as though she possessed natural talents that had been waiting for proper cultivation. The concept of becoming a dark justiciar was introduced to her as the ultimate expression of devotion to Shah, a rank that few achieved and fewer still proved worthy to maintain. These elite servants of the Night Singer were described as living embodiments of their goddess's will, warriors who had transcended ordinary limitations through the complete surrender of personal desires. To become such a figure was presented as the highest honor any mortal could achieve, a transformation that would make her truly immortal through the permanence of her service. The specific trials and sacrifices required for such elevation were discussed only in general terms during her early training. She understood that great tests lay ahead, challenges that would require her to prove her worthiness through actions rather than words. The knowledge that such opportunities awaited filled her with anticipation rather than dread, the eager excitement of someone who had found her life's purpose and could hardly wait to fulfill it completely. Her parents remained a presence in her life throughout these years, though their role shifted gradually from that of family members to that of spiritual teachers whose suffering provided lessons about the nature of attachment and loss. She was allowed to visit them regularly, but these encounters were carefully structured to reinforce the theological points she was learning in her formal education. She watched them age and weaken under the strain of their captivity, but this decline was presented to her as evidence of the merciful nature of endings rather than tragedy to be mourned. Their pain became a curriculum in the study of impermanence, their gradual surrender of hope, a demonstration of the peace that could be found in accepting reality rather than fighting against it. When she offered them comfort, she did so not as their daughter, but as Shah's representative, bringing the gift of her goddess's dark wisdom to souls that were learning to let go. The suppression of her original memories was completed through rituals that she experienced as spiritual purification rather than psychological violation. The final ceremonies involved the willing surrender of attachments that might distract her from perfect service to her goddess. Standing in chambers deep beneath the earth, surrounded by symbols that seemed to pulse with their own dark life, she formally renounced any claims to identity beyond her role as Shah's servant. The person who emerged from these rituals was someone who had never been anyone other than Shadowheart, whose entire existence had been shaped by devotion to the Mistress of Night, whose memories of family and childhood were understood as tests of faith rather than authentic experiences. She retained access to her past, but it felt increasingly like knowledge about someone else, information that might be academically interesting but had no real emotional significance. By the time her basic training was complete, Shadowheart had become exactly what Viconia had intended to create, a perfectly devoted servant of Shah, whose every thought and action reflected her goddess's will, whose personal desires had been so thoroughly subsumed into religious duty that the distinction between self and service had ceased to exist. She was intelligent enough to think creatively about how to advance Shah's interests, skilled enough to handle complex assignments independently, but psychologically incapable of questioning whether those interests were worth advancing. The mission that would define her adult life was presented to her as both honor and responsibility, a task that required someone with her particular combination of skills and devotion. An ancient artifact of tremendous power had been located, an object that could shift the balance of divine influence in Shah's favor if it could be retrieved and properly utilized. The assignment would require her to leave the hidden compound that had been her home for so many years, to venture into a world that had forgotten the true wisdom of darkness. She accepted this mission with the eager devotion of someone who had been waiting her entire life for such an opportunity to prove herself. The prospect of leaving behind the only home she could clearly remember was not frightening but exciting, a chance to finally put her training to meaningful use. The knowledge that she carried with her, the hopes and expectations of everyone who had invested in her development, filled her with determination rather than pressure. As she prepared for departure, taking with her only the equipment and supplies necessary for the journey ahead, Shadowheart looked back on her years of preparation with satisfaction and gratitude. She had been rescued from ignorance and abandonment, educated in truths that most people never learned, trained in skills that would allow her to serve purposes greater than any individual ambition. The parents she dimly remembered were safe in Shah's care. The village of her birth was revealed to have been an illusion, and she was finally ready to become who she had always been destined to be. The woman who walked away from Viconia's compound bore little resemblance to the child who had been brought there in chains, yet she carried within herself seeds of that original identity that no amount of conditioning could entirely destroy. Deep in the places where memory becomes instinct, where love transcends thought, the essence of Genevieve remained intact, waiting for circumstances that would allow her to remember what had been taken and choose who she wished to become. The artifact that would ultimately seal Shadowheart's fate lay hidden in a vault that had been sealed for centuries, protected by wards that few living beings possessed the knowledge to penetrate. The retrieval itself had taken months of careful preparation, reconnaissance that required her to assume false identities and infiltrate organizations whose very existence was dedicated to preventing exactly the kind of theft she intended to commit. Yet when the moment came to claim her prize, all the elaborate planning seemed almost anticlimactic compared to the weight of what she held in her hands. The object was smaller than she had expected, roughly the size and shape of a child's fist, its surface carved from some material that seemed to shift between stone and metal depending on the angle of observation. Strange runes covered its exterior, symbols that hurt to look at directly and seemed to writhe when glimpsed from peripheral vision. When she first touched it, the artifact had grown warm against her palm, as though responding to her presence with something approaching recognition or approval. The power emanating from the device was unlike anything she had encountered during her years of training under Viconia's guidance. This was not merely magical energy, but something older and more fundamental, a force that seemed to operate according to rules that predated the current understanding of how reality functioned. Holding it made her feel simultaneously more powerful and more vulnerable, as though she had gained access to capabilities that came with responsibilities she could not yet comprehend. The journey back to the Sharan enclave in Baldur's Gate should have been straightforward, a simple matter of maintaining her disguise while traveling roads she had walked many times before. Shadowheart had planned her route carefully, avoiding areas where her activities might have attracted unwanted attention, while staying close enough to populated areas to discourage bandits or other opportunistic threats. Everything had proceeded according to schedule until the moment when the sky itself seemed to tear open above her. The nautiloid that descended from the rift between planes was a vessel that belonged in nightmares rather than waking reality. Its form combined the worst aspects of sea creature and mechanical construct, a ship grown rather than built, its hull pulsing with organic rhythms that suggested something alive and malevolent. Enormous tentacles writhed from its underside, each appendage longer than any building in Baldur's Gate and possessed of its own terrible intelligence. The speed with which the creature moved defied its apparent size and bulk. One moment, Shadowheart had been walking along a forest path, her thoughts focused on the importance of delivering the artifact to her superiors. And the next she found herself swept up by appendages that moved with the precision of hands and the strength of siege engines. The world blurred around her as she was lifted toward the ship's underbelly, where openings gaped like mouths ready to swallow her whole. The interior of the nautiloid was even more disturbing than its external appearance had suggested. Every surface seemed to be alive, walls that breathed and floors that yielded slightly underfoot with each step. The corridors were lit by bioluminescent patches that pulsed in rhythm with some vast heartbeat, creating an atmosphere that was part cathedral and part digestive system. The air itself was thick with moisture and alien scents that spoke of biology following rules that had nothing to do with terrestrial life. The mind flayers who inhabited this floating nightmare moved through their ship with the fluid grace of beings perfectly adapted to their environment. Their elongated heads, crowned with tentacles that seemed to possess independent life, marked them as creatures from realms far removed from any world that supported human existence. These illithids represented a form of horror that transcended physical threat, beings whose very presence suggested the complete dissolution of individual consciousness into something alien and incomprehensible. The Ceramorphosis chambers where they brought her were designed with the clinical precision of creatures who had perfected this process across countless worlds and countless victims. Pods lined the walls in orderly rows, each one containing what had once been a thinking being now reduced to raw material for the creation of new mind flayers. The tadpoles that would complete this terrible transformation writhed in pools of cerebrospinal fluid, their movements suggesting an eagerness to find new hosts for their alien consciousness. The process of implantation was both swift and traumatic, conducted with the efficient cruelty of beings who viewed it as simply another routine procedure. When they forced the tadpole behind her eye, Shadowheart felt something fundamental shift in her perception of reality. The pain was immediate and overwhelming, but beneath the agony lay something else entirely, a presence that was not her own beginning to explore the pathways of her mind. The tadpole's influence was unlike anything she had experienced during her years of psychological conditioning under Viconia's care. Where the memory suppression rituals had been subtle and gradual, This intrusion was immediate and invasive, a foreign consciousness that began mapping the geography of her thoughts with predatory efficiency. She could feel it cataloging her memories, her skills, her deepest fears and desires, preparing to consume everything that made her who she was. Yet something unexpected happened as the creature established its presence in her mind. The bonds that had tied her to Shah's will, connections forged through years of careful manipulation and magical compulsion, began to weaken under the tadpole's influence. The parasite, in its eagerness to remake her brain according to its own patterns, was inadvertently severing supernatural links that had defined her existence for over a decade. The sensation of mental freedom was indescribable to someone who had lived so long under external control. For the first time since her childhood capture, Shadowheart found herself capable of thoughts that were genuinely her own, emotions that arose from her authentic self, rather than from carefully programmed responses. The tadpole had granted her a terrible gift, the return of her individual agency at the cost of her eventual transformation into something utterly inhuman. The other prisoners who shared her fate represented a cross-section of the countless worlds and peoples that the mind flayers preyed upon in their endless expansion across the plains. Each pod contained someone who had been living their own life, pursuing their own goals, until the moment when tentacles had reached down from the sky to drag them into this floating charnel house. Their faces, visible through the translucent walls of their containers, showed the slack expressions of those whose minds were already being consumed by the parasites growing within their skulls. Among these victims, 3 individuals would prove instrumental in Shadowheart's survival and eventual liberation. Lae'zel, a Githyanki warrior, whose people had fought the mind flayers for generations, possessed natural resistances to psychic domination that made her a formidable ally despite the cultural tensions that would inevitably arise between them. Her presence in the Ceramorphosis chamber was itself a mystery, as the Githyanki were among the few races that Illithids actively avoided capturing due to their inherent abilities to resist mental control. Gale of Waterdeep had been a wizard of considerable power before his capture, though the easy charm and scholarly manner he presented concealed depths of magical knowledge that bordered on the dangerous. His presence aboard the Nautiloid suggested connections to forces and events far beyond the scope of ordinary academic pursuit. The magical energies that surrounded him even in captivity spoke of someone who had delved into mysteries that most mages would consider too perilous to explore. The third member of what would become their unlikely fellowship was someone whose nature was immediately apparent despite his attempts at charm and misdirection. Astarion carried himself with the predatory grace of a creature that had learned to view other beings primarily as sources of sustenance. Yet something in his manner suggested that this predatory nature had been imposed upon him rather than chosen. His pale skin and the way he avoided direct sunlight marked him as one of the undead, though the specific circumstances that had led to his transformation remained carefully concealed. The attack that would ultimately free them came without warning, though the signs had been building for some time in the form of mechanical vibrations that shook the Nautiloid's living structure. The Githyanki who boarded the vessel were mounted on red dragons whose very presence seemed to make the ship's organic components recoil in instinctive terror. These dragon riders moved through the corridors with the methodical precision of warriors who had faced mind flayers many times before and understood exactly how to exploit their weaknesses. The battle that raged through the ship was brief but devastating, pitting the Illithid's psychic powers against the Githyanki's supernatural resistance to mental domination. The Mind Flayer's usual tactics of paralyzing enemies with psionic blasts proved ineffective against opponents who had been bred and trained specifically to counter such abilities. The corridors filled with the sounds of combat as ancient enemies renewed their eternal war in the confines of the living ship. The Ceramorphosis pods began to malfunction as the Nautiloid systems were damaged by the ongoing battle. Emergency releases triggered throughout the chamber, freeing prisoners who had been intended for transformation into unwilling servants of the Elder Brain. Shadowheart found herself expelled from her containment in a rush of amniotic fluid that left her gasping and disoriented on the chamber's breathing floor. The first moments of freedom were chaotic and terrifying, filled with alarms that screamed in frequencies that seemed designed to induce panic and despair. The ship lurched and shuddered around them as battle damage accumulated, its organic systems struggling to maintain basic functions while under constant assault. Emergency lighting cast everything in hellish red illumination that made the already nightmarish environment even more disturbing. Lae'zel was the first to take charge of their desperate situation, her warriors' training allowing her to assess their circumstances and begin planning for survival with remarkable speed. Her people's long experience fighting mind flayers had provided her with knowledge of nautiloid construction and weaknesses that proved invaluable in navigating the ship's damaged corridors. She spoke with the authority of someone accustomed to command, though her obvious disdain for what she perceived as the weakness of her fellow survivors created immediate tensions. The artifact that Shadowheart had risked so much to obtain remained in her possession, though its significance had shifted dramatically now that she was free from Shah's direct control. What had once been a sacred duty to deliver to her superiors now became a bargaining chip, whose true value remained unclear. The device seemed to pulse with greater intensity in the presence of the mind flayers, as though responding to their proximity with something approaching hostility. Gale's magical expertise proved crucial in their efforts to reach the ship's helm, where the controls that might allow them to escape the ongoing battle were located. His spells provided both offensive capabilities against the ship's remaining defenses and protective barriers that shielded them from the worst effects of the psychic emanations that filled the air. Yet there was something in his manner that suggested his magical knowledge came with costs that he was reluctant to discuss. Asterion's contributions to their escape were more subtle but no less important, his enhanced senses allowing him to detect threats and opportunities that others might miss. His supernatural agility and strength proved invaluable in navigating the ship's damaged passages, though his obvious discomfort with revealing his true nature created an atmosphere of mutual suspicion that complicated their cooperation. The helm of the Nautiloid was a chamber that perfectly embodied the ship's fusion of biological and mechanical elements. The controls were integrated into what appeared to be a massive brain, its surface covered with neural pathways that pulsed with electrical activity. Operating such a system required not just technical knowledge but the willingness to make direct mental contact with an alien intelligence whose thought processes bore no resemblance to human consciousness. The desperate activation of the ship's planar travel capabilities came just as Githyanki warriors breached the helm chamber, their dragon mounts filling the space with superheated breath that should have incinerated everyone present. The dimensional shift that followed was violent and disorienting, reality twisting around them as the ship tore through barriers between planes of existence. The Nautiloid's damaged systems struggled to maintain cohesion during the translation, causing random jumps that took them through realms never meant for mortal eyes. The final materialization above the Sword Coast was as much crash as landing, the ship's organic hull splitting open as it struck the earth with tremendous force. The impact should have killed everyone aboard, yet something intervened at the last moment to cushion the blow and preserve their lives. Whether this protection came from divine intervention, magical accident, or some property of the artifact Shadowheart carried remained unclear in the immediate aftermath of survival. Awakening on the beach near the wreckage was like emerging from a nightmare into a world that seemed almost too bright and clean after the horrors of the Nautiloid. The morning sun, which Shadowheart had not seen in years due to her nocturnal lifestyle in service to Shah, felt warm against her skin in ways that she had forgotten were possible. The simple act of breathing air that had not been filtered through alien biology was revelatory in its sweetness. The tadpole in her head remained active, its presence a constant reminder of the time limit that governed their continued existence. Yet the parasite's interference with her connection to Shah had created opportunities for independent thought and action that she had not possessed since childhood. The question of what to do with this unexpected freedom was both liberating and terrifying, offering possibilities she had been conditioned to see as impossible. The fellowship that formed among the survivors was born of necessity rather than natural affinity, yet it provided something that none of them had possessed individually, a support network that might make survival possible in circumstances that would have defeated any of them alone. Each member brought skills and knowledge that complemented the others, creating a whole that was greater than the sum of its parts despite the secrets and suspicions that complicated their relationships. The search for a cure to their tadpole infection became the driving force that united them, despite their different backgrounds and conflicting agendas. Shadowheart's knowledge of divine magic, Gale's arcane expertise, Lae'zel's understanding of mind flayer biology, and Astarion's supernatural resilience all contributed to their collective chances of finding a solution before Ceramorphosis completed its work. Yet, each also carried private goals and hidden motivations that would inevitably complicate their cooperation. The artifact continued to pulse with mysterious energy, its influence apparently extending beyond mere protection from the tadpole's mental effects. Shadowheart found herself drawn to study its properties with an intensity that went beyond academic curiosity, though whether this attraction stemmed from her own interests or from some external influence remained unclear. The device seemed to respond to her attention with increased activity, as though recognizing her as its intended bearer. The world they found themselves in was one balanced on the edge of catastrophe, though the full scope of the threat they faced would only become clear through investigation and experience. The Mind Flayer's presence was part of a larger pattern of supernatural disturbance that affected everything from local politics to the fundamental stability of reality itself. Their escape from the Nautiloid had not ended their involvement in these cosmic events, but had merely changed their perspective from victims to potential agents of resolution. As they established their first camp and began to plan their next moves, Shadowheart looked around at her unlikely companions and felt something she had not experienced since childhood, genuine uncertainty about what the future might hold. For someone who had lived for years with every decision predetermined by religious duty, this freedom to choose was both exhilarating and overwhelming. The path ahead was unclear, but for the first time in over a decade, it was hers to determine. The days that followed their escape from the Nautiloid wreckage were marked by a strange sense of liberation that Shadowheart found both exhilarating and deeply unsettling. For someone who had lived her entire adult life according to carefully prescribed patterns of behavior and thought, the sudden freedom to make genuine choices about her actions and allegiances was like learning to use muscles that had been paralyzed for years. Every decision, from the simple matter of which direction to travel to the more complex questions of whom to trust and why, required conscious deliberation in ways that felt both empowering and exhausting. The fellowship that had formed among the tadpole victims was an unlikely assemblage of individuals who would never have chosen each other's company under normal circumstances. Yet their shared predicament created bonds that transcended the usual barriers of class, culture, and personal inclination. Each morning brought new challenges that required them to coordinate their diverse skills and perspectives, gradually building the kind of trust that could only emerge from repeatedly depending on others for survival. Gale's scholarly enthusiasm for their predicament initially struck Shadowheart as somewhat inappropriate given the grave nature of their situation, yet she came to appreciate the way his intellectual curiosity helped maintain morale during their darkest moments. His extensive knowledge of magical theory provided frameworks for understanding what was happening to them that made their circumstances seem more manageable, even if no immediate solutions presented themselves. The wizard's cheerful demeanor concealed depths of pain and regret that occasionally surfaced in unguarded moments, revealing someone who understood loss and consequence far better than his academic manner might suggest. Lae'zel's warrior culture created initial friction with the more diplomatically inclined members of their group, yet her unflinching honesty about the dangers they faced proved refreshing after years of living surrounded by people who specialized in beautiful lies and comfortable deceptions. The Githyanki's straightforward approach to problem solving, while sometimes brutal in its simplicity, offered clarity that helped cut through the confusion and uncertainty that plagued their daily decisions. Her obvious expertise in matters relating to mind flayers provided crucial guidance that kept them alive during their earliest encounters with the lasting effects of their captivity. Astarion's nature, as one of the undead, was something that Shadowheart recognized long before he chose to reveal it explicitly. Her years of theological training having provided her with extensive knowledge about the various forms that undeath could take. Yet, rather than feeling horror or revulsion at this discovery, she found herself curious about the circumstances that had led to his transformation and the ways in which his condition might actually prove advantageous to their collective survival. His obvious expertise in stealth and infiltration suggested skills that could complement her own training in moving unseen and unnoticed. The artifact that she carried continued to pulse with mysterious energy, its influence extending far beyond the simple protection from ceremorphosis that had initially saved their lives. She found herself drawn to study its properties during quiet moments, turning it over in her hands while trying to decipher the meaning of the runes that covered its surface. The warmth it generated seemed to respond to her emotional state, growing stronger when she felt threatened or uncertain, as though the device possessed some form of rudimentary consciousness that was attempting to provide comfort. The dreams that came to her during their rest periods were unlike anything she had experienced during her years of service to Shah. Instead of the carefully curated visions that had reinforced her religious training, these nocturnal experiences felt wild and uncontrolled, filled with imagery that seemed to come from sources beyond her own imagination. Sometimes she found herself walking through landscapes of impossible beauty, places where light and shadow danced together in patterns that spoke of harmony rather than conflict. Other times she encountered figures whose faces she could never quite remember upon waking, though their words of encouragement and guidance seemed to resonate with truths that her conscious mind was not yet ready to acknowledge. The most disturbing aspect of these dreams was how they seemed to connect her to her companions in ways that transcended normal boundaries of individual consciousness. Through the psychic static generated by their shared tadpole infection, she caught glimpses of their thoughts and memories that revealed the depth of trauma and loss that each carried. Gale's guilt over some magical catastrophe that had claimed innocent lives, Lae'zel's struggle to reconcile her people's rigid expectations with her growing appreciation for other cultures, Astarion's centuries of psychological torture and enforced servitude. All of these burdens became partially her own through the unwanted intimacy created by their infection. Yet these glimpses into her companions' inner lives also revealed reservoirs of strength and resilience that inspired her own efforts to overcome the conditioning that had shaped her for so many years. Watching Gale maintain his scholarly enthusiasm despite carrying the weight of tremendous guilt, seeing Lae'zel question fundamental assumptions while retaining her essential integrity, observing Astarion's attempts to forge genuine connections despite centuries of betrayal and exploitation, all of these examples provided models for the kind of personal transformation that she was beginning to realize might be possible for herself. The theological questions that arose from their situation created the most profound challenge to Shadowheart's established worldview. Her training under Viconia had prepared her to see divine influence in terms of clear hierarchies and absolute loyalties. Yet their current circumstances seemed to demonstrate that the gods operated according to principles that were far more complex and mysterious than she had been taught to believe. The protection they had received during the Nautiloid crash could not easily be attributed to Shah's intervention, yet neither could it be dismissed as mere coincidence or magical accident. The artifact's apparent ability to shield them from the Absolute's influence raised particularly troubling questions about the nature of divine authority and the competing claims that different powers might make upon mortal allegiance. If Shah was truly the supreme goddess that Shadowheart had been taught to revere, why would her enemies possess artifacts capable of resisting the influence of beings that claimed divine status? The logical implications of their protection suggested either that Shah's power was more limited than her followers believed, or that the theological framework within which Shadowheart had been trained was fundamentally incomplete. Her interactions with places and objects sacred to other deities provided the first concrete challenges to the religious certainties that had defined her adult life. When they encountered shrines dedicated to Saloon during their travels, Shadowheart found herself experiencing physical and emotional responses that did not align with what her training had led her to expect. Instead of the revulsion and anger that should have accompanied exposure to her goddess's primary enemy, she felt strange stirrings of recognition and longing that seemed to come from sources deeper than conscious memory. The decision to reveal her true religious allegiance to her companions was one of the most difficult she had ever made, requiring her to overcome years of conditioning that had made secrecy and misdirection into reflexive responses to any form of scrutiny. Yet, the bonds that were developing between them seemed to demand a level of honesty that made continued deception feel not just impractical, but actively harmful to relationships that were becoming genuinely important to her. The relief that came with finally speaking openly about her faith was accompanied by anxiety about how her revelations would affect the trust that had been slowly building among their group. To her surprise, her companions' responses to learning about her devotion to Shah were characterized more by curiosity than judgment. Rather than recoiling in horror or demanding that she justify her allegiance to a goddess widely regarded as evil, they asked thoughtful questions about her beliefs and experiences that suggested genuine interest in understanding her perspective. This acceptance felt almost miraculous to someone who had been conditioned to expect hostility and rejection from anyone who learned about her religious identity. The conversations that followed her revelation allowed her to articulate aspects of her faith that she had never been encouraged to examine critically. Speaking with people who approached Sharon theology as an intellectual puzzle rather than a source of absolute truth helped her recognize contradictions and inconsistencies that her training had taught her to ignore or rationalize away. The gaps between the ideals that Shah supposedly represented and the actual practices required of her followers became more apparent when viewed through the eyes of outsiders who had no emotional investment in maintaining those beliefs. The mysterious wound on her hand became a subject of particular fascination for her companions, who recognized it as something far more significant than the simple mark of divine favor that she had been taught to consider it. Their questions about its origin, its behavior, and its apparent connection to her emotional state forced her to confront the possibility that what she had always regarded as a blessing might actually be evidence of manipulation and control. The pain that flared when she attempted to act contrary to Shah's presumed wishes began to feel less like divine guidance and more like a supernatural leash designed to ensure her continued obedience. Her growing awareness of the wound's true nature was accompanied by increasing clarity about other aspects of her past that she had accepted without question during her years of training. The memories of her childhood rescue from the wolf attack, which had always felt somewhat dreamlike and uncertain, began to seem even more suspicious when examined alongside evidence of the elaborate psychological manipulation that had shaped her adult identity. If the Sharans had been willing to suppress her authentic memories and replace them with manufactured alternatives, what other aspects of her supposed history might be equally false? The tadpole's interference with the magical bonds that tied her to Shah's will created opportunities for independent thought and emotional response that revealed just how extensive that control had been. Feelings and impulses that she had never experienced during her years of service began to emerge with increasing frequency: curiosity about theological questions that had always been forbidden topics, sympathy for people whose suffering served Shah's purposes, doubt about whether the ends supposedly achieved by her goddess's methods were worth the means required to accomplish them. The process of rediscovering her capacity for autonomous moral judgment was both liberating and terrifying, like regaining the use of limbs that had been bound for so long that she had forgotten they existed. Each decision to act according to her own ethical instincts rather than according to Sharan doctrine felt like a small act of rebellion that might be discovered and punished at any moment. Yet the absence of immediate consequences began to demonstrate that her freedom to choose was more real and more extensive than she had dared to believe possible. Her relationships with her companions evolved from mere alliance of convenience into something approaching genuine friendship, as she learned to interact with others based on authentic interest in their welfare rather than calculated assessment of their usefulness. The simple pleasure of conversation that was not designed to advance any particular agenda, of laughter that arose spontaneously rather than being deployed as a social tool, of concern for others that was motivated by affection rather than duty. All of these experiences felt revolutionary after years of relating to other people primarily as targets for conversion or sources of information. The revelation of her earliest memory through the tadpole connection represented the deepest level of trust and vulnerability that she had ever shared with another person. The images of her supposed rescue by Sharan cultists had always been accompanied by emotional responses that did not quite match the narrative she had been taught to associate with them, gaps between feeling and meaning that she had learned to ignore rather than investigate. Sharing these memories with someone whose perspective was not shaped by Sharan indoctrination allowed her to recognize inconsistencies that pointed toward a very different interpretation of events. The growing suspicion that she might not actually be an orphan who had been saved from abandonment created both hope and terror in equal measure. If her parents were still alive, if they had spent years believing that their daughter was lost forever, then her current freedom represented not just personal liberation but the opportunity to restore relationships that had been severed by violence and deception. Yet the prospect of discovering that everything she thought she knew about her origins was false would require rebuilding her sense of identity from foundations that might prove to be equally unstable. Her companion's willingness to support her quest for truth about her past, despite the obvious dangers and complications that such investigations might create, demonstrated a level of loyalty and care that challenged every assumption she had been taught about the fundamental selfishness of human nature. Their readiness to risk their own safety for her emotional well-being suggested that the bonds between them had transcended mere pragmatic cooperation to become something resembling the family relationships that her manufactured memories claimed she had never possessed. The artifact continued to pulse with increasing intensity as they traveled deeper into regions where supernatural forces were actively contending for dominance. Its protective influence seemed to extend beyond simple shielding from psychic domination to encompass a broader form of spiritual resistance to corruption and manipulation. Carrying it felt like bearing a piece of genuine freedom in physical form, a talisman that helped maintain her growing sense of individual agency, even when circumstances threatened to overwhelm her fragile independence. The dreams that accompanied their rest periods became increasingly vivid and coherent, suggesting that the tadpole's influence was creating connections not just between the members of their group, but with larger patterns of meaning and purpose that extended far beyond their individual concerns. Sometimes she found herself experiencing visions that seemed to come from perspectives other than her own, glimpses of ancient conflicts between divine powers, memories of civilizations that had risen and fallen according to principles that might illuminate their current situation. possibilities for futures that depended upon choices that had not yet been made. The growing awareness that their personal struggles were connected to much larger cosmic conflicts created both a sense of overwhelming responsibility and a framework for understanding why their individual growth and healing might matter. For reasons that extended beyond their own welfare, if the forces that had manipulated and controlled them were part of patterns that affected entire worlds and countless lives, then their resistance to those forces represented more than mere personal rebellion. It was a form of spiritual warfare that might help determine the ultimate balance between freedom and control, between authentic growth and manufactured compliance. As they approached regions where the influence of the being called the Absolute was stronger and more apparent, Shadowheart found herself experiencing increasing clarity about the nature of the choice that lay ahead of her. The mission that had originally brought her into conflict with the Mind Flayers now seemed like part of a much larger struggle between powers that sought to impose their will upon others and forces that supported individual agency and authentic development. The artifact she carried might represent more than just a tool for resistance. It could be a symbol of the principle that thinking beings had the right to determine their own destinies rather than serving as instruments for others' purposes. The path forward remained uncertain, filled with dangers that might destroy not just their physical lives but the psychological progress that each of them was making toward becoming more complete and autonomous individuals. Yet for the first time since her childhood, Shadowheart faced that uncertainty with hope rather than fear, supported by relationships that were based on mutual respect rather than hierarchical control, guided by values that she was choosing for herself rather than accepting from external authorities. The journey ahead would test everything she was learning about herself and the world, but she would face those tests as herself rather than as someone else's creation. The journey toward the shadow-cursed lands began with subtle changes in the landscape that spoke of corruption seeping into the very bones of the earth. What had once been fertile farmland now lay barren and grey, the soil itself seeming to reject any attempt at cultivation or growth. Trees that should have been green with summer foliage stood leafless and brittle, their branches reaching toward the sky like skeletal fingers pleading for mercy that would never come. Even the air felt different here, thick with an oppressive weight that made each breath an effort and filled the lungs with the taste of despair. Shadowheart felt the change more acutely than her companions, though she could not initially understand why her body responded to this blighted region with such intensity. Her skin prickled with sensations that had nothing to do with temperature or humidity, as though invisible fingers were tracing patterns across her arms and back. The mysterious wound on her palm began to pulse with greater frequency, its rhythm matching something in the environment that called to it with increasing urgency as they traveled deeper into the affected area. The artifact she carried seemed to resonate with whatever force had claimed dominion over these lands, its surface growing warm against her skin, while the runes that covered it began to emit a faint luminescence that was barely visible in daylight but became more apparent as evening approached. The device's behavior suggested recognition of something familiar, as though it had encountered the power that ruled here before and remembered the circumstances of that previous meeting with perfect clarity. The roads they traveled were eerily empty of normal commerce and traffic, devoid of the merchants, pilgrims, and ordinary travelers who should have been moving between the settlements that dotted this region. The few structures they encountered stood abandoned, their doors hanging open like mouths frozen in silent screams, their windows dark and lifeless. Yet there was no evidence of the kind of sudden catastrophe that might explain such wholesale desertion, no signs of battle, no indication of plague or natural disaster, simply the gradual abandonment that comes when life becomes too difficult to sustain. As the sun began to set on their first day in the cursed lands, the true nature of the threat that governed this region became apparent. The shadows that fell across the landscape were not merely the natural absence of light, but something active and malevolent, tendrils of darkness that moved with purpose and intelligence. These creeping patches of supernatural night seemed to drain vitality from anything they touched, leaving behind husks and remnants that spoke of life consumed rather than simply ended. The protective influence of the artifact became crucial as these shadow tendrils began to probe the edges of their camp, seeking entry past whatever barriers shielded them from the region's malevolent attention. Shadowheart found herself serving as the focal point for this protection, her connection to the device somehow allowing her to channel its power more effectively than her companions could manage. The responsibility felt both natural and terrifying, marking her as essential to their survival while making her acutely aware of how much depended upon forces she did not fully understand. The dreams that came to her that night were filled with visions of this land as it had once been, when green fields and healthy forests had stretched to the horizon under skies unmarked by supernatural corruption. She saw communities where people had lived and worked and loved, places where children had played and elders had shared wisdom gained through long years of experience. The contrast between these images of past vitality and the present desolation created a profound sense of loss that felt personal despite her lack of any conscious memory of this region. When morning came, bringing with it the pale light of a sun that seemed somehow diminished by its passage through the cursed atmosphere, they encountered their first clear sign that the region was not entirely devoid of life. Smoke rose from a distant structure that proved to be an inn, its lights burning with the warm glow of normal fire rather than the cold illumination that characterized supernatural sources. The building stood surrounded by wards and protective barriers that held the encroaching darkness at bay, creating an island of relative safety in an ocean of supernatural threat. Last Light Inn proved to be exactly what its name suggested, perhaps the final bastion of hope in a region that had been systematically drained of everything that made existence bearable. The people who had gathered there represented a cross-section of refugees, survivors, and those who had chosen to make their stand against the forces that sought to claim dominion over the living world. Their faces bore the marks of prolonged stress and constant vigilance, yet they maintained an atmosphere of determined resistance that spoke to the resilience of mortals when faced with seemingly impossible odds. Jahera, the half-elven druid who served as the de facto leader of this resistance, possessed the kind of quiet authority that came from years of making difficult decisions under pressure. Her assessment of their situation was both pragmatic and hopeful, acknowledging the severity of the threat they faced while maintaining confidence that solutions could be found through careful planning and coordinated action. The knowledge she shared about the Shadow Curse's origins provided crucial context for understanding both its nature and its potential weaknesses. The revelation that General Catheric Thorm was responsible for the curse that plagued these lands came as a shock to Shadowheart, though not for the reasons that her companions might have expected. The name was familiar to her from her religious education, mentioned in the historical accounts of Shah's greatest servants as someone who had achieved the rank of Dark Justicia and led armies in her name. That such a devoted follower of her goddess had become something that needed to be opposed created cognitive dissonance that challenged her understanding of divine authority and religious loyalty. The story of Ketheric's transformation from Sharon Champion to undead abomination raised disturbing questions about the ultimate fate of those who served her goddess with complete devotion. If someone who had achieved the highest ranks of Shah's priesthood could fall so far from grace, what did that suggest about the path that Shadowheart herself had been following? The implications were troubling enough that she found herself reluctant to share her knowledge of Sharon theology with the Harpers, uncertain whether such information would be helpful or would simply complicate relationships that were already strained by conflicting loyalties. The protective dome that surrounded the inn was maintained by Isabel, a cleric of Saloon whose very presence created profound discomfort in Shadowheart's mystically conditioned nervous system. The divine magic that the other woman channeled represented everything that her training had taught her to regard as antithetical to proper spiritual development. Yet she could not deny the obvious effectiveness of Selûnite power in holding back forces that served darkness and despair. The cognitive dissonance between her theological conditioning and the evidence of her own experience created an internal tension that grew more acute with each passing hour. The irony of accepting protection from a servant of her goddess's greatest enemy was not lost on Shadowheart, though she struggled to reconcile this practical necessity with the religious certainties that had defined her worldview for so many years. The blessing that Isabel offered to extend to their group would provide crucial protection against the shadow curse, but accepting such aid felt like a betrayal of everything she had been taught about the fundamental opposition between Shah and Selûne. Yet the alternative was to venture into the cursed lands without adequate protection, a choice that seemed more like suicide than religious devotion. The pain that accompanied her exposure to Selûnite magic was intense enough to bring tears to her eyes. Though whether this suffering originated from genuine incompatibility between opposing divine forces or from psychological conditioning designed to prevent exactly this kind of cooperation remained unclear. The wound on her hand blazed with agony that seemed to originate from sources beyond mere physical sensation, as though something was actively punishing her for accepting help from the wrong theological source. Despite the discomfort involved, Shadowheart found herself oddly moved by Isabel's genuine concern for their welfare and her willingness to extend protection to people she barely knew simply because they were in need. This kind of unconditional compassion stood in stark contrast to the conditional acceptance that characterized relationships within Sharon communities, where approval was always contingent upon continued service and demonstration of proper devotion. The cleric's offer of aid came with no strings attached, no expectation of reciprocal service or conversion to her religious perspective. The blessing itself felt strange against her skin, like wearing clothes that had been tailored for someone with a completely different body shape. The divine energy that Isabel channeled seemed to slide off her natural defenses rather than integrating smoothly with her existing magical protections, creating an uncomfortable sensation of competing influences that never quite achieved harmony. Yet the practical effectiveness of the protection was undeniable, allowing her to move through shadow-touched areas that would otherwise have drained her strength and vitality within minutes. The deeper regions of the shadow-cursed lands revealed the true scope of the devastation that Ketheric's actions had wreaked upon this once thriving area. Entire towns lay buried beneath supernatural darkness so thick that it seemed almost solid, their inhabitants transformed into shadow creatures that retained just enough of their original identities to make their current state particularly tragic. These were not monsters created through natural processes, but people who had been systematically corrupted and transformed against their will, victims of magical forces that had perverted their very essence. The resistance that she felt to the curse's influence was unlike anything she had experienced during her travels through other magically affected areas. Where most supernatural threats required active effort to repel, the shadow curse seemed to flow around her like water encountering a stone. Unable to gain purchase on her spiritual essence, despite repeated attempts to establish some form of connection. This immunity was not complete. She could still feel the curse's presence and influence, but it was significant enough to mark her as somehow different from her companions in ways that demanded explanation. The artifact's behavior in this environment provided crucial clues about its true nature and purpose. Rather than simply providing passive protection, the device seemed to actively oppose the forces that governed these lands, its luminescence growing brighter and more focused whenever they encountered areas where the curse was particularly strong. The runes that covered its surface began to shift and rearrange themselves in patterns that suggested some form of communication or response to external stimuli, though the meaning of these changes remained frustratingly obscure. Her growing understanding of the curse's origins helped explain why her connection to Shah might provide protection rather than vulnerability in this environment. If Ketheric had indeed been corrupted by forces that were opposed to or competitive with Shah's influence, then her goddess might view resistance to his power as a form of indirect service to her interests. Yet this interpretation raised uncomfortable questions about the nature of divine politics and the possibility that gods might sacrifice their followers' well-being for the sake of larger strategic considerations. The encounters with shadow-touched creatures that had once been human beings created profound emotional conflicts that her training had not prepared her to handle. Her religious education had taught her to view such transformations as natural consequences of spiritual weakness or failure to embrace proper theological principles. Yet seeing the obvious suffering of these victims made such interpretations feel callous and inadequate. These were not people who had chosen corruption, but innocents who had been overwhelmed by forces beyond their ability to resist. The gradual revelation that she possessed, not just resistance to the shadow curse, but active protection against its influence, created both opportunities and responsibilities that she was reluctant to accept. Her companions began to rely upon her presence for their safety in ways that made her feel essential to their survival, while simultaneously increasing the pressure to use her abilities in service of their collective mission. The knowledge that others' lives might depend upon her spiritual condition added weight to decisions that were already complicated by competing loyalties and uncertain consequences. The signs of ancient Sharan presence in the region became more apparent as they traveled deeper into the cursed lands, suggesting that her goddess's influence in this area predated Ketheric's rebellion by centuries, if not millennia. Ruined temples and abandoned shrines bore the architectural signatures of her faith, their stones carved with symbols that resonated with power despite their obvious age and weathering. These discoveries provided tantalizing hints about the history of Shah's involvement in this region and the possibility that current events were part of patterns that stretched back through generations of conflict and alliance. The growing certainty that their path would eventually lead them to a significant Sharan temple or holy site created anticipation that was equal parts excitement and terror. Such locations were traditionally testing grounds where devotees could prove their worthiness for advancement within the faith's hierarchy. Yet they were also places where failure might result in consequences far more severe than simple disappointment or embarrassment. The knowledge that she was approaching such a test while her loyalty to Shah was already compromised by doubt and growing independence created anxiety that manifested in physical symptoms she struggled to conceal from her companions. The dreams that came to her during their rest periods in the shadow-cursed lands were more vivid and coherent than anything she had experienced since childhood, filled with imagery that seemed to come from sources beyond her conscious imagination. Sometimes she found herself walking through vast underground chambers carved with intricate reliefs that told stories of divine conflict and mortal sacrifice, their walls lined with artifacts that pulsed with power that was both fascinating and terrifying. Other times she encountered figures whose faces were hidden by shadow, but whose voices carried the authority of beings who had transcended ordinary limitations through service to purposes larger than individual desire. These visions seemed to be preparing her for something significant, providing information and context that her conscious mind would need to understand events that lay ahead. The emotional content of the dreams was complex and contradictory, combining anticipation of triumph with fear of failure, pride in approaching a goal she had sought for years with growing certainty that achieving that goal might require sacrifices she was no longer willing to make. The tension between these competing responses created an internal conflict that grew more acute with each passing day. The approach to regions where Shah's influence was strongest brought both relief and apprehension, like returning to a childhood home that had been altered beyond recognition during a long absence. The familiar elements were still present, the particular quality of darkness that characterized her goddess's domain. The sense of ancient power that had shaped these places for purposes that transcended mortal understanding, yet something had changed in ways that made the familiar feel foreign and potentially dangerous. The artifact's response to approaching areas of concentrated Sharon influence was complex and unpredictable, sometimes growing warmer and brighter as though welcoming proximity to sympathetic power, other times seeming to recoil from contact with forces that should have been allied with its purpose. These inconsistent reactions suggested that the device's relationship to Shah was more complicated than simple service or opposition, involving distinctions and conflicts that she lacked the knowledge to understand fully. The weight of impending destiny began to press upon her consciousness with increasing intensity as they traveled deeper into the heart of the shadow-cursed lands. Every step forward felt like movement toward a confrontation that would determine not just her individual fate, but the larger patterns of conflict that had shaped this region for generations. The choices that awaited her would require her to decide not just what she believed about divine authority and religious duty, but who she was willing to become in service of those beliefs, and whether the cost of such transformation was one she was prepared to pay. The grand mausoleum rose before them like a monument to the inevitability of endings, its ancient stones weathered by centuries of rain and wind until the original carvings had been worn to suggestions rather than clear declarations. The structure belonged to the Thorm family. That much was evident from the heraldic symbols that still decorated its facade, yet there was something about its construction that spoke of purposes beyond mere commemoration of the dead. The proportions were too grand for a simple burial site, the architecture too complex for a monument intended primarily for mourning and remembrance. Shadowheart approached the mausoleum with a sense of anticipation that seemed to come from sources deeper than conscious expectation. Her steps slowed as they neared the entrance, not from reluctance, but from a growing awareness that something of tremendous significance awaited her within those shadow-draped halls. The artifact she carried had grown noticeably warmer as they traveled through the cursed lands, but here it began to pulse with an intensity that was almost uncomfortable, as though responding to proximity to something that shared its essential nature. The exterior of the mausoleum showed clear signs of recent visitation, though the evidence was subtle enough that only someone trained in observation would have noticed the slight displacement of dust around the entrance, the barely perceptible wear patterns that suggested regular passage by individuals who preferred to remain undetected. Someone else had been coming to this place with frequency and purpose, someone who understood the importance of discretion in their activities. The interior revealed itself gradually as they passed through the heavy doors that had been designed to keep out more than merely weather and wild animals. The chambers beyond were carved from living rock, their walls decorated with reliefs that told stories of death and rebirth, of sacrifice and transformation, of endings that were also beginnings. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, revealing skills that had been applied with the kind of passionate devotion that could only come from deep religious conviction. Yet, beneath the obvious symbols of mourning and memorial, Shadowheart began to recognize motifs that spoke to her trained eye with the clarity of a familiar language. The patterns carved into the stone, the arrangement of chambers and corridors, the particular quality of darkness that seemed to gather in certain corners, all of it bore the subtle signatures of Sharon architecture, designs that had been integrated so skillfully with the mausoleum's ostensible purpose that casual observers might never notice their true significance. The hidden mechanism that would reveal the structure's deeper secrets was located through a combination of theological knowledge and divine guidance that felt like remembering something she had always known rather than discovering something new. Her hands moved across the carved surfaces with the confidence of someone following a half-remembered map, pressing sequences of symbols in orders that seemed random but carried meaning that resonated in her bones. When the concealed passage finally opened, revealing stairs that descended into darkness beyond the reach of ordinary torches, Shadowheart felt a profound sense of homecoming that was immediately complicated by equally strong feelings of apprehension and dread. This was what she had been seeking without knowing she was seeking it, the destination toward which all her training and preparation had been directed, yet approaching it felt like walking toward her own judgment and potential condemnation. The descent into Shah's domain was gradual but unmistakable, each step taking them deeper into an environment that had been consecrated to her goddess through centuries of ritual and sacrifice. The air itself felt different here, thick with the accumulated weight of devotion and suffering that had sanctified these chambers for purposes that transcended ordinary understanding. The darkness was not mere absence of light but active presence of shadow, substance rather than void, embracing rather than excluding. The gauntlet of Shah revealed itself in stages, its true scope and purpose becoming apparent only as they penetrated deeper into the complex of chambers and corridors that had been carved from the living rock. This was not merely a temple, but a testing ground, a place where devotees could prove their worthiness to advance within the faith's hierarchy through trials that challenged every aspect of their dedication to Shah's principles. The architectural grandeur of the space was overwhelming, speaking to resources and planning that had spanned generations of devoted service. Every surface was decorated with symbols and reliefs that told the story of Shah's relationship with her followers, depicting scenes of transformation and transcendence that inspired both awe and terror in equal measure. The scale of construction suggested that this place had been intended to serve as more than a local shrine, that it was meant to be a center of pilgrimage and advancement for Sharans from across the known world. Yet the gauntlet was not empty of other presences, as they discovered when their exploration brought them into contact with individuals whose purposes in this sacred space were far from aligned with reverent pilgrimage. Balthazar, the necromancer who served as Catherick Thorm's chief advisor, moved through these halls with the casual confidence of someone who regarded them as his personal workspace rather than as sanctified ground deserving of respectful treatment. The meeting with this defiler of sacred space created immediate tension that was both theological and practical in nature. Shadowheart's training had prepared her to recognize heresy in its various forms, and Balthazar's casual appropriation of Sharon's symbols and spaces for his own necromantic purposes represented exactly the kind of corruption that true devotees were obligated to oppose. Yet their mission required cooperation with forces that served Catherick's interests, at least temporarily, creating conflicts between religious duty and practical necessity. The necromancer's knowledge of the temple's deeper secrets was both valuable and disturbing, revealing that he had spent considerable time exploring chambers that should have been accessible only to properly initiated devotees. His casual references to the trials and their purposes demonstrated understanding that could only have come from extensive study or direct observation of the gauntlet's operation, suggesting either that security had been thoroughly compromised or that the traditional restrictions on access had been deliberately circumvented. The revelation that the object known as the Night Song was housed within the temple's innermost sanctum provided crucial context for understanding both Balthazar's presence and the larger conflicts that surrounded Catherick's presence. Apparent immortality. If this relic was indeed the source of the general's supernatural resilience, then controlling access to it would be essential for anyone hoping to bring his reign of terror to an end. Yet the location of such a significant magical artifact within Shah's most sacred space raised questions about the relationship between divine authority and temporal power. The trials that comprised the gauntlet proper were designed to test every aspect of a devotee's commitment to Shah's principles, challenging not just their knowledge of theological doctrine, but their willingness to sacrifice personal desires for the sake of perfect service. Each chamber presented different forms of spiritual ordeal, some requiring intellectual understanding of complex philosophical problems, while others demanded physical courage in the face of supernatural threats that could easily prove fatal to the unprepared. Shadowheart approached these trials with the mixture of confidence and humility that her training had taught her to maintain in sacred spaces. She understood that success would require not just technical competence but genuine spiritual readiness, a state of inner preparation that could not be achieved through mere study or practice. The years of conditioning that had shaped her identity as a devotee of Shah would either prove sufficient for these challenges or reveal fundamental inadequacies in her development that no amount of effort could overcome. The trial of selflessness required her to navigate a maze of mirrors that reflected not her physical appearance, but her deepest motivations and desires, forcing her to confront aspects of herself that she had learned to suppress or ignore during her years of training. Each reflection showed a different version of who she might become depending upon the choices she made in the trials ahead, possibilities that ranged from transcendent spiritual achievement to corruption and damnation that would make her current struggles seem trivial by comparison. The ordeal of loss demanded that she experience the systematic removal of everything she had learned to value, beginning with material possessions and advancing through relationships, memories, and finally aspects of personal identity that she had considered fundamental to her sense of self. The magic involved in this trial was subtle and sophisticated, creating experiences that felt completely real while remaining ultimately reversible. Though the emotional impact of witnessing her own complete dissolution was nearly overwhelming despite her intellectual understanding of the process. The test of faith presented her with scenarios that challenged every aspect of her theological understanding, forcing her to choose between conflicting interpretations of Shah's will that all seemed equally valid based on the doctrine she had been taught. These dilemmas had no clear solutions that could be derived from simple rule following, requiring instead the kind of spiritual intuition that could only come from genuine relationship with the divine rather than mere intellectual comprehension of religious principles. Throughout these trials, the artifact she carried continued to pulse with increasing intensity, its behavior suggesting that it was responding to the same forces that powered the gauntlet itself. The device seemed to serve as both compass and catalyst, guiding her toward correct responses while simultaneously amplifying her natural abilities in ways that made success more achievable than it might otherwise have been. Yet this assistance came with its own form of pressure, creating expectations of performance that added psychological weight to challenges that were already formidable. The acquisition of the Spear of Night and the Dark Justiciar armor marked her successful completion of the preliminary trials, though she understood that these were merely preparations for the ultimate test that awaited in the temple's deepest chambers. The weapons and armor were not simply tools but symbols of her advancement within the faith's hierarchy, physical manifestations of spiritual achievements that had been earned through demonstrated worthiness rather than merely granted through ceremony or appointment. Wearing the Dark Justiciar armor felt like putting on an identity that she had been preparing for her entire adult life, yet the experience was more complex than simple fulfillment of long-held aspirations. The magical properties of the equipment were immediately apparent, enhancing her physical capabilities while providing protections that went beyond mere defense against mundane threats. Yet the armor also seemed to exert subtle influences on her thoughts and emotions, encouraging responses that aligned with Sharan doctrine while discouraging forms of independent judgment that might lead to questioning or hesitation. The Spear of Night carried its own form of spiritual weight, its magical energies resonating with powers that she could sense but not fully comprehend. The weapon felt perfectly balanced in her hands, as though it had been crafted specifically for her use, yet wielding it also created awareness of responsibilities that extended far beyond personal combat effectiveness. This was a tool that had been designed for purposes that transcended individual needs or preferences, an instrument of divine will that would shape not just her actions, but her understanding of what those actions were meant to accomplish. The deeper chambers of the gauntlet revealed progressively more complex and dangerous trials, each one building upon lessons learned in previous challenges, while introducing new forms of spiritual and physical jeopardy. The architects of this place had understood that true advancement required not just the mastery of individual skills, but the integration of different forms of knowledge and capability into coherent systems that could function under extreme pressure. The trial of shadows required her to navigate environments where normal perception was not just unreliable but actively misleading, forcing her to develop new forms of awareness that could function independently of visual input. The magical darkness that filled these chambers was not merely absence of light, but presence of forces that actively interfered with conventional senses, creating conditions where only spiritual intuition could provide reliable guidance. The ordeal of sacrifice demanded that she demonstrate willingness to surrender aspects of herself that she valued deeply, beginning with preferences and advancing through attachments that had shaped her identity since childhood. Each relinquishment was both painful and liberating, creating space for new forms of understanding, while simultaneously diminishing the resources she could draw upon for emotional support during the trials ahead. The test of wisdom presented her with moral and philosophical dilemmas that had no solutions that could satisfy all competing claims of justice, mercy, and practical necessity. These scenarios forced her to develop frameworks for decision-making that could function in situations where traditional ethical guidelines provided conflicting or inadequate guidance, requiring forms of judgment that could only come from deep spiritual maturity. The presence of Yurga, the devil who had been bound by contract to eliminate all traces of Sharon presence from the gauntlet, added an element of immediate physical danger to challenges that were already demanding in spiritual and psychological terms. The creature's supernatural power and cunning made direct confrontation inadvisable, yet his mission of destruction meant that coexistence was ultimately impossible. The solution to this dilemma required not just tactical skill but understanding of infernal contract law that could identify loopholes and technicalities that might provide escape from apparently impossible situations. The puzzle of the night song became increasingly complex as more information became available about its true nature and significance. What had initially appeared to be a simple magical artifact proved to be something far more complicated, involving divine politics and ancient conflicts that extended far beyond the immediate concerns of Ketheric's immortality or Shadowheart's advancement within Sharon hierarchy. The revelation that the Night Song was not merely an object but a living being created moral complications that her training had not prepared her to address. The possibility that her spiritual advancement might require the sacrifice of a sentient creature forced her to confront questions about the relationship between personal growth and ethical responsibility that challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of divine service. The approach to the gauntlet's innermost sanctum felt like walking toward the culmination of her entire life's purpose. Yet, the weight of accumulated revelations and growing doubts created internal conflicts that threatened to undermine her ability to complete the trials successfully. The gap between what she had been taught to expect from this moment and the reality of what she was experiencing grew larger with each step toward the final chamber. The portal that would take her into Shah's own domain awaited in the temple's deepest chamber, its surface rippling with energies that spoke of connections to realms beyond mortal understanding. Standing before this gateway, Shadowheart felt the full weight of every choice that had brought her to this moment, every lesson learned, and every sacrifice made during her years of preparation. The trials of the gauntlet were complete, but the ultimate test of her faith and devotion lay beyond the threshold that separated the material world from her goddess's direct presence. The moment of stepping through the portal would mark the end of one phase of her existence and the beginning of something entirely new, transformation that would either elevate her to unprecedented heights of spiritual achievement or destroy everything she thought she understood about herself and her place in the cosmic order. The choice to proceed was entirely hers, yet the momentum of years of preparation and the expectations of those who had invested in her development created pressures that made refusal seem almost impossible to contemplate. The passage through the portal into the Shadowfell was like stepping from the world of substance into a realm where emotion had become geography, where the landscape itself was shaped by the accumulated weight of loss and ending that had occurred across all planes of existence. The transition was not violent, but profound. A dissolution of familiar boundaries that left Shadowheart feeling simultaneously more herself than she had ever been, and completely uncertain about what that self might actually comprise. The domain of Shah that greeted her beyond the threshold was unlike anything her theological training had prepared her to experience. Instead of the orderly darkness that characterized Sharon temples in the material world, this was a place where shadow had texture and weight, where the absence of light carried its own form of illumination that revealed truths too painful or complex for ordinary vision to comprehend. The very air seemed to whisper with voices of those who had found in ending their only form of beginning, who had discovered in loss the only honest form of possession. Dame Aelin, the being known as the Night Song, stood bound by chains that were not merely physical restraints but manifestations of magical compulsions that had held her captive for decades. Her form radiated the kind of divine presence that made the space around her seem somehow more real than the shadow realm that contained it, as though her existence served as an anchor point between the material world and this domain of pure concept and emotion. The moment when Shadowheart raised the Spear of Night, feeling its weight balanced perfectly in her hands while Shah's voice echoed through her consciousness with commands that brooked no hesitation or question, should have represented the culmination of everything she had worked towards since her rescue from the wolves in that distant forest. This was her moment of transformation from devoted follower to true instrument of divine will, the achievement of the rank of Dark Justiciar that had represented her highest aspiration for longer than she could clearly remember. Yet as the weapon descended toward its target, as the point of the spear moved through the thick air of the Shadowfell toward the heart of the bound celestial being, Dame Aelin spoke words that shattered the carefully constructed narrative that had defined Shadowheart's understanding of her own identity and purpose. The Arsimar's voice carried not the desperate pleading that might have been expected from someone facing imminent death, but the calm authority of someone who possessed knowledge that could illuminate rather than merely postpone the approaching moment of violence. The revelation that she had been stolen from parents who loved her, that her memories of rescue were manufactured illusions designed to make her complicit in her own psychological destruction, that the very wound on her hand served as a mystical link that allowed her suffering to torture the family members she had been conditioned to forget. These truths struck her consciousness like physical blows that left her reeling with their implications. The spear wavered in her hands as competing versions of reality warred for dominance in her mind. On one side stood the familiar narrative of her life that had been reinforced through years of careful conditioning, the story of an orphan saved by benevolent cultists who had recognized her potential and nurtured her towards spiritual fulfillment. On the other side lay possibilities that were both more wonderful and more terrible than anything she had been allowed to imagine. Parents who had spent decades in captivity, their love for her transformed into an instrument of torture, their hope for her freedom the only thing that had kept them alive through years of systematic abuse. The moment of choice that followed felt like standing at the center of a cosmic balance, where her decision would determine not just her individual fate, but the nature of reality itself as it pertained to questions of love, sacrifice, and the possibility of redemption after unforgivable acts. The weight of the spear in her hands seemed to increase with each second of hesitation, as though the weapon itself was growing heavier under the pressure of competing divine wills that sought to influence her final choice. Dame Aelin's words about the true nature of Dark Justiciars, about the emptiness that awaited those who achieved that rank through the complete surrender of personal identity and emotional connection, provided context that made Shadowheart's lifelong ambition seem less like spiritual achievement and more like a form of elaborate suicide. The promise of power and recognition that had motivated her through years of training was revealed to be a trap that would destroy everything about her that made existence worthwhile, leaving behind only a perfectly efficient instrument of divine will that would no longer possess the capacity for growth, change, or authentic relationship. The defiance that rose within her felt like the return of faculties that had been suppressed for so long that she had forgotten they existed. The ability to say no to authority, to question the wisdom of those who claimed divine mandate for their commands, to value her own judgment above the expectations of others. These capacities emerged from places in her psyche that had been carefully walled off during her years of conditioning, but had never been entirely destroyed. The consequences of her refusal to complete the sacrifice were immediate and overwhelming. Shah's response to such unprecedented disobedience was not mere anger, but a form of cosmic rage that threatened to tear apart the fabric of reality itself within the Shadowfell. The goddess who had been praised for her patience and wisdom revealed herself to be something far more petty and vindictive, a being whose love for her followers was entirely contingent upon their absolute submission to her will. The pain that followed was unlike anything Shadowheart had experienced during her years of training or her trials within the Gauntlet. This was not the clean suffering that came from physical injury or even the complex anguish that accompanied difficult spiritual growth, but something that attacked the very foundations of her sense of self. The mystical wound on her hand became a conduit for agony that seemed to flow from sources beyond the material world. Punishment that was designed not just to cause suffering, but to demonstrate the complete futility of resistance to divine authority. Yet even as Shah's wrath poured through her nervous system like liquid fire, even as the pain threatened to overwhelm her ability to think or act coherently, Shadowheart found within herself reserves of strength that she had not known she possessed. The love that her parents had given her during her early childhood, buried beneath layers of manufactured memory and systematic conditioning, reasserted itself as a force more powerful than fear or pain. The knowledge that somewhere in the world people who cared about her were suffering because of her actions provided motivation that transcended mere self-preservation. The banishment from Shah's presence that followed her defiance was experienced as both punishment and liberation. Expulsion from the only spiritual home she had ever known, combined with freedom to discover what other forms of meaning might be possible for someone who was no longer defined by service to external authority. The goddess's declaration that she was now an outcast, that all of Shah's children would know her as an enemy and treat her accordingly, carried the weight of comprehensive social death, yet also suggested possibilities for rebirth that had never existed within the confines of absolute religious conformity. The return to the material world came as a shock to her system that had grown accustomed to the symbolic geography of the Shadowfell, where emotions became landscapes and abstract concepts possessed physical substance. The sudden restoration of normal sensory experience, the return of familiar boundaries between self and environment, the reassurance of natural laws that operated according to predictable principles, all of this felt simultaneously comforting and somehow insufficient after exposure to realms where deeper truths could be directly experienced rather than merely contemplated. Her companions' responses to her transformation were complex and varied, reflecting their individual relationships with questions of faith, authority, and the possibility of meaningful change after years of apparently fixed identity. Some expressed relief that she had chosen to reject what they perceived as a path towards spiritual and moral destruction, while others showed concern about the practical consequences of defying a goddess whose power and influence extended far beyond the boundaries of any single plane of existence. The growing awareness that she had retained some connection to divine power despite her rejection of Shah's authority raised questions about the nature of religious relationship that her theological training had not prepared her to address. The magic that flowed through her when she attempted to heal injuries or provide protection still carried traces of shadow and mystery, yet it no longer felt like energy borrowed from an external source, but like power that originated from her own spiritual development and moral choices. The artifact that had protected them throughout their journey began to behave differently in response to her transformation, its pulsing rhythm shifting to match changes in her emotional and spiritual state rather than responding to external threats or opportunities. The device seemed to recognize her newfound independence as something worthy of support rather than control, offering guidance that enhanced her natural abilities without attempting to override her individual judgment or decision-making processes. Dame Aylin's promise to provide information about her true family and their current circumstances created anticipation that was equal parts hope and terror. The possibility of reunion with parents who had never stopped loving her despite years of separation and the trauma of watching their daughter transform into an instrument of their own torture represented the kind of profound healing that seemed almost too wonderful to be real. Yet the knowledge of what she had been forced to do to them during her training, the recognition of her complicity in their suffering, even if that complicity had been manufactured through psychological manipulation, created guilt that threatened to overwhelm her capacity for self-forgiveness. The spear that had nearly ended Dame Aylin's existence was transformed through Selûnite blessing into something that could serve constructive rather than destructive purposes. Yet wielding it continued to feel like carrying a reminder of the choice she had made and the life she had rejected. The weapon's new properties reflected her spiritual transformation while maintaining connections to her training and capabilities that allowed her to remain effective in combat situations that might require the use of force to protect innocent lives. The physical changes that began to manifest in her appearance reflected the internal shifts that were occurring in her spiritual and psychological makeup. Her hair, which had been black as the deepest shadow throughout her years of service to Shah, began to lighten towards silver and white, colors that spoke of moonlight and possibility rather than endings and loss. These transformations were not merely cosmetic, but manifestations of fundamental alterations in her relationship to divine power and her understanding of her place in the cosmic order. The growing connection to Selûnite mysticism felt like remembering a language she had spoken fluently in childhood but had been forbidden to use for so many years that conscious access to it had been nearly lost. The moon goddess's influence was subtler than Shah's commanding presence, but also more respectful of individual agency and moral development, offering guidance that enhanced rather than replaced personal judgment and decision-making abilities. The dreams that came to her during rest periods were filled with images of her parents as they existed in the present, rather than as they had appeared in her earliest memories. These visions showed her people who had been aged by suffering but not broken by it, individuals whose love for their daughter had sustained them through decades of captivity and abuse. The knowledge that they had maintained hope for her freedom and return, despite having every reason to despair, provided both comfort and additional motivation for the rescue mission that lay ahead. The development of new relationships with her companions was complicated by her transformation from someone who had been defined by service to external authority into someone who was learning to trust her own moral intuition and emotional responses. The bonds that had formed during their shared trials were strong enough to survive her spiritual metamorphosis, yet they required renegotiation as she discovered aspects of her personality that had been suppressed during her years of religious conditioning. The growing awareness that her liberation from Shah's control was only the beginning of a much longer process of healing and self-discovery created both excitement and apprehension about the work that lay ahead. The psychological patterns that had been established during her formative years would require conscious effort to identify and modify, while the relationships with her parents and other family members would need to be rebuilt from foundations of honesty rather than the carefully constructed deceptions that had defined her previous interactions with them. The knowledge that Viconia de Vere and other high-ranking Sharans would view her transformation as betrayal requiring punishment added practical urgency to spiritual and emotional healing processes that might otherwise have been pursued at a more measured pace. The techniques and resources she had developed during her years of training would remain valuable for survival purposes, yet using them effectively would require integrating them with new ethical frameworks that prioritize protection and healing over control and manipulation. The approach to Baldur's Gate carried significance beyond mere geographical movement, representing return to the city where her parents were being held captive and where the final confrontation with her former religious community would inevitably take place. The urban environment would present challenges and opportunities that were very different from the wilderness areas where most of their recent adventures had occurred, requiring forms of social navigation that would test her ability to function effectively while maintaining the integrity of her newly discovered authentic self. The artifact continued to serve as both compass and catalyst, its behavior providing guidance toward their ultimate destination while simultaneously amplifying her natural abilities in ways that made success more achievable than it might otherwise have been. Yet the device's support came without the strings attached that had characterized her relationship with Shah's power, offering assistance that enhanced rather than replaced individual agency and moral responsibility. The weight of knowledge about what awaited them in the House of Grief created anticipation that was both eager and fearful, hope for reunion with family members combined with dread about the condition in which decades of captivity might have left them. The possibility that her parents might not survive the trauma of rescue, or that they might be so changed by their experiences that meaningful relationship would no longer be possible, forced her to confront questions about love, loss, and the prices that sometimes must be paid for freedom and truth. The transformation that had begun with her refusal to sacrifice Dame Aylin continued to unfold in ways that affected every aspect of her existence, from her understanding of divine authority to her capacity for intimate relationship with others. The person she was becoming felt both familiar and foreign, like returning to a childhood home that had been extensively renovated during a long absence. The essential structure remained recognizable, but nearly every detail had been altered in ways that required conscious adjustment and relearning of basic navigational skills. The future stretched ahead with possibilities that had been unimaginable during her years of religious servitude, yet pursuing those possibilities would require forms of courage and wisdom that her training had not provided. The path toward reuniting with her family and building authentic relationships based on mutual respect rather than hierarchical authority would test everything she was learning about herself and the world in ways that might prove more challenging than any trial she had faced within Shah's gauntlet. The approach to Baldur's Gate carried weight that extended far beyond simple geographical movement, marking as it did the return to a city that held within its walls both her origins and her destination, the place where her childhood had ended and where her adult understanding of family and identity would be put to the ultimate test. The urban landscape that spread before them was familiar yet strange, like encountering a childhood friend who had aged in unexpected ways during a long separation. The buildings and streets remained recognizable, but something essential had changed in ways that spoke to influences she was only beginning to understand. The outer districts of the city showed clear signs of the supernatural conflicts that had been raging across the region, evidence of forces that operated according to rules very different from those that governed normal political and economic disputes. Refugees from the shadow-cursed lands had established temporary settlements wherever space could be found, their faces bearing the hollow expressions of people who had witnessed things that challenged their fundamental assumptions about the nature of reality and the reliability of divine protection. Shadowheart moved through these crowds with the careful awareness of someone who understood that recognition could bring consequences she was not yet prepared to face. Her transformation from devoted Sharon to religious exile was still too recent and too incomplete for her to feel confident about her ability to defend herself against the kind of coordinated attack that her former allies might organize. If they discovered her presence in the city, the skills and knowledge she had developed during her years of training remained valuable for survival purposes. Yet using them effectively required constant vigilance about the ethical implications of actions that had once been automatic responses to perceived threats. The contact with Ferg Droga, one of Shah's followers who recognized her despite her changed appearance, provided both unwelcome confirmation that her former associates were aware of her presence and crucial information about where her parents were being held. The encounter was brief, but laden with significance that extended beyond the simple exchange of words, representing, as it did, the first direct confrontation with representatives of the religious community that had defined her identity for so many years. The knowledge that the House of Grief served as both temple and prison, a place where Sharans conducted their most sensitive operations while maintaining the facade of providing comfort to those who had experienced loss, created anticipation that was equal parts hope and terror. Her parents had been held in this location for decades, subjected to conditions that she could only imagine based on her understanding of Sharon methodology and her growing awareness of how thoroughly she had been manipulated throughout her own captivity and training. The building itself stood in one of Baldur's Gate's more respectable districts, its exterior architecture designed to suggest solemnity and compassion rather than the darker purposes that were pursued within its walls. The ironies inherent in this deception were not lost on someone who had spent years learning to present herself as something other than what she truly was, who understood intimately how easily surface appearances could be manipulated to conceal activities that would horrify those who encountered only carefully curated public presentations. The approach to the House of Grief required careful planning and coordination with her companions, whose diverse skills and perspectives would be essential for navigating the challenges that awaited within. Each member of their fellowship brought capabilities that complemented the others, creating tactical options that would have been impossible for any individual acting alone. Yet the personal significance of this mission for Shadowheart created emotional pressures that threatened to compromise the clear thinking and coordinated action that successful infiltration would require. The interior of the house revealed itself gradually as they penetrated deeper into spaces that had been designed to serve multiple functions simultaneously. The public areas maintained the atmosphere of respectful mourning and spiritual comfort that the building's external appearance suggested. Yet subtle architectural details spoke to purposes that extended far beyond simple pastoral care for those dealing with loss and grief. The corridors were too wide for purely domestic purposes, the chambers too numerous for the stated mission of providing counseling and support services. The mapping of the heart ceremony that awaited her upon deeper penetration into the building represented both spiritual ordeal and psychological warfare, a process designed to strip away the protective barriers that she had constructed around her transformed identity, while forcing her to confront aspects of her past that she had been conditioned to suppress or forget. The ritual was conducted with the kind of theatrical precision that spoke to years of practice and refinement, each element calculated to maximize emotional impact while maintaining the appearance of religious solemnity. Mother Superior Viconia de Vere's presence at the center of these proceedings provided answers to questions that Shadowheart had been carrying for years, while simultaneously raising new mysteries about the true scope and purpose of the Clease provided. Manipulations that had shaped her life. The Drow cleric who had orchestrated her childhood kidnapping and subsequent conditioning represented everything that was both impressive and terrifying about Sharan methodology, demonstrating levels of patient planning and psychological sophistication that spoke to resources and commitment that transcended ordinary human limitations. The revelation of Viconia's true identity and her connections to legendary figures from the city's past added historical weight to confrontations that might otherwise have seemed like merely personal conflicts between former allies who had chosen different paths. The knowledge that this woman had been involved in events that had shaped the political and spiritual landscape of entire regions provided context for understanding both her capabilities and the stakes involved in opposing her continued activities. The theological discussions that preceded more direct forms of conflict revealed the extent to which Viconia's devotion to Shah had evolved beyond simple religious observance into something approaching obsession with proving her goddess's superiority over all competing sources of meaning and authority. Her willingness to sacrifice entire communities of devoted followers for the sake of advancing what she perceived as Shah's interests demonstrated the kind of fanaticism that could justify virtually any action in service of brain-sieving by Dolmen. Sufficiently abstract ideological goals. The battle that followed was both intensely personal and broadly symbolic, representing conflicts between competing visions of religious authority, individual agency, and the proper relationship between divine power and mortal freedom. Each blow struck and spell cast carried significance that extended beyond immediate tactical considerations to encompass questions about the nature of spiritual growth and the price that might justifiably be demanded for transcendence of ordinary human limitations. Viconia's defeat came not through superior magical power or tactical brilliance, but through the application of principles that she had taught during Shadowheart's training, yet had never truly understood herself. The patience, adaptability, and willingness to embrace apparent loss in service of larger strategic goals that characterized the most sophisticated Sharon methodology proved equally effective when applied against practitioners who had become too rigid in their thinking to respond creatively to unexpected challenges. The revelations that followed the Mother Superior's defeat provided crucial information about the true scope of the psychological manipulation that had shaped not just Shadowheart's life but the entire structure of relationships within the Sharon community. The systematic use of memory suppression and manufactured trauma to create bonds of dependence and loyalty represented a level of spiritual corruption that went far beyond simple religious extremism to encompass forms of abuse that violated the most basic principles of consent and individual dignity. The knowledge that her parents had been forced to witness and participate in her transformation, that they had watched helplessly as their daughter was systematically conditioned to serve the very people who had stolen her from them, created guilt and rage that threatened to overwhelm her capacity for rational thought and strategic action. The recognition that she had unknowingly served as an instrument of their torture throughout her years of training made every memory of religious accomplishment into a source of shame and self-recrimination. The descent into the chamber of loss where her parents were being held represented both the culmination of her quest and the beginning of challenges that would test everything she had learned about love, forgiveness, and the possibility of healing after unforgivable harm. The physical condition in which decades of captivity had left them was shocking, even to someone who understood intellectually what prolonged imprisonment under Sharon's supervision might involve. Evidence of suffering that had been carefully calibrated to maintain life and awareness